merchant and banking classes of Germany who sought to wrest financial control from the papacy. It's also interesting to note that if you go to Wittenberg or you go to Worms and you go and look at the original documents of Martin Luther, you'll find that on the leather-bound covers you'll see the rose cross, the symbols of the Rosicrucians. So here's the person purported to be the founder of a modern Christian religion, and yet he's funded by secret societies and even has their logos on the front covers of his books. The exact same logos that later turn up on the American dollar bill and on the Tudor dynasty. The Church exerted a complete stranglehold over all forms of intellectual life and education from early on in its unholy alliance with Rome until the 12th century. The respect for education that was one of the great distinguishing characteristics of the classical Roman Empire was swept away. This is Tim Wallace Murphy in his book Ross Lynn, speaking about the coming of the Dark Ages. Thomas Jefferson also says, "The clergy converted the simple teachings of Jesus into an engine for enslaving the world, and adulterated by artificial constructions into a connivance to filch wealth and power to themselves. These clergy, in fact, constitute the real Antichrist." At the top of the crown of the Queen of England, we find the Malta Cross. The Queen is the head of the Knights of Malta, another secret society. And the Nazis, of course, used also the Malta Cross. But this is a very ancient device. The Nazis also used the oak leaves, the skull and bones of the pirates, and the eagle, the old Habsburg symbol, the old skull and bones symbol of the Knights Templar, the Knights of Malta Cross, and the oak leaves of the ancient Druids. Now one might ask, what on earth, again, in the military, in something that has to do with mass death and mass casualty, what are oak leaves doing? On the lapels, we find oak leaves around the hats of the French military. We find them on the lapels of the Russian military. In fact, we find acorns on the hats of the cavalry of the United States of America. Ancient Druidic bardic symbols of theological elites now found on the uniforms of the military mass murderers of the world. That's right. The reason is, as I said, if you're going to sacrifice somebody to the macrobes, you have to mark them for death. You not only have to send a person to the right ritualistic place, but you have to have them dressed for the ritual. The virgin must be dressed for the ritual. They must be marked for death. So you put a bunch of occult symbols on them and send them out to die. The individual just looks in the mirror and thinks they look damn good, but they don't realize what these occult symbols mean. The ribbons and the bells and the whistles and the badges and the emblems of state, the coins, the flags, all the heraldry. It has a meaning in occult theocracy. In America, we have the Ku Klux Klan. This word originally comes from the Greek kuklos, which meant the Knights of the Golden Circle. Now the Grand Master refers to himself as the dragon. They wear the Knights of Malta Cross. They burn crosses, wear white robes like the Knights Templar, and have a racist ideology. And we'll be coming back to the Ku Klux Klan a little bit later. Now we see the Knights of Malta Cross together with the symbol of the dove on the maces of the Queen of England. And it turns out that the Spanish or old word for dove is columb. And that's why we have the District of Columbia, Columbia Pictures and Records, Columbia Shuttle, all the drugs coming from Colombia, South America. We have British Columbia and we have Christopher Columbus. But the word Columbus means the doves. The Knights of Columbus is a secret fraternity run by the Queen of England. It does not represent the Holy Spirit. If we look today on the Visa credit cards on the right-hand side, you'll see the little symbol of the dove. And people never ask, what does this symbol, this so-called holy symbol that's meant to represent the Holy Spirit, what's it doing on the credit cards? Well, it is a dove, but it has nothing to do with the Holy Spirit. It has to do with a secret fraternity known as the Knights of Columbus. The Knights of Malta Cross is also known as the Black Sun. And of course, the Black Sun is the symbol of the Smithsonian Institute in America. And the swastika was even referred to by the Nazis as a black sun. Himmler never got tired of calling the Nazis an order, a lodge, a black lodge. Now the Anunnaki, which is the ancient Sumerian word for the fallen angels, is very close to the word Nazi. One of the 8 children of the mother goddess Ninharsag, Naz, was also refers to Canis Major, a constellation that Sirius occupies. Again, Jesus of Nazareth, from Nasir, meaning Sirius. The Knights of Malta Cross is seen here on the picture on the left in ancient Pictish. These are the Picts of Scotland, using not only the serpent, not only the swastika, but the Knights of Malta Cross. A very ancient symbol. But the fact that we see it here with the serpent is very suggestive. Here again we see it on ancient lances of the Teutonic peoples. Now, of course, just like the old Atlanteans, we have the Nazis being very interested in the concept of race and eugenics and genetics, in polygamy and population control. We also have the phenomena of Siamese twins and midgets and deformities and blemishes and the extra nipple and whatnot. Witches were burned for their blemishes. We have congenital hemophilia. We have the ritual of bonding by blood. We have freaks, the whole concept of the Siamese twins that comes down to us, that just put down to us as being freakish, individuals, strange mutations. But could these not be throwbacks to genetic manipulations and genetic experiments that were being done not too far back in our Earth history? Now, Charles Darwin, who wrote Origin of the Species, what we often don't realize is the full title of that book. The full title was Origin of the Species and the Preservation of the Favored Races. Charles Darwin was also funded by occultists, specifically the Royal Academy. Now, Herbert Spencer, the philosopher, while Darwin got the credit, the leading proponent of this chilling racial evolutionary theory was Herbert Spencer, whose ideas were based on race. Spencer was more explicit than Darwin in his conclusion. Only one race was capable of ascending to the highest levels of the evolutionary spiral. The others would be left behind. So here we have an occult agenda of blood, of race, and of mass murder. Because remember, the pontifications of philosophers in the 19th century and of the 20th century are being carried out, they're being implemented in the world. The Nazis implementing occult theocracies coming from occult societies, like the Thule Society and the Freemasons and the occultists of the ancient world, Ordo Templi Orientis. And in America and Britain, it's no different. The Knights Templar, the Knights of Columbus, the Freemasons. The Nazis are steeped, as anyone who studies their symbolism can see, in occultism. They often refer to themselves as the Order of the Black Sun. The official historians now generally accept that occult orders, some very ancient and some new, were operating behind the Nazi Party and other political parties in Germany. The same historians seem conspicuously reluctant, however, to transpose these facts to the British and American political milieu, even when ample evidence exists to prove it, and even when many of the elites of the European occult orders, plus industrialists, publishers, and scholars, were related to international aristocratic families and dynasties. It is a fact that the Vatican helped Hitler to gain power and then helped him to consolidate his grip on Germany. This was done in part by advising the Catholic Party of Germany to vote for the Nazi candidates. The Third Reich is the first power which not only recognizes but puts into practice the high principles of the papacy. This is Franz von Papen, second only in command to Adolf Hitler, is literally telling you that the Third Reich is implementing the principles of the Vatican, the principles of the papacy. But who are the papacy officiating for? Now, of course, when we talk here in programs like this about the Vatican, please understand that we're not talking about Roman Catholicism as a religion. There's a very great difference between Roman Catholicism as a practicing religion and Vatican, the institution of Catholicism, the institution of the Vatican, the nation state, the state within a state. These are two completely different animals here. Behind one of the great thinkers and philosophers behind the Nazi Party, close friend to Rudolf Hess and to Adolf Hitler, was Karl Haushofer, He created what is known as geostrategical theory. He propounded it, and he was the teacher of Rudolf Hess. And Rudolf Hess introduced Haushofer to Adolf Hitler. It's a very important character to study. In the Origins and Oracles series, we have a program called Evil's Willing Servants, and we go into a little bit of Haushofer's background. It makes very interesting listening. One of the most powerful occult societies behind the politics of Germany was called the Thule Society, or the Thule Society, founded in 1912 by Rudolf von Bottendorf, a major Freemason, an expert in Islamic and Oriental mysticism. In 1918, Thule member Karl Harrer forms the Workers' Political Circle, and in 1919 he renames that the German Workers' Party, later headed by Adolf Hitler, who took over from mystic Dietrich Eckart. It became the Nazi Party. Now the word Tula, or Thule, means northerly place or homeland, and it refers to Atlantis. Again, one of the thinkers specifically beloved by Adolf Hitler was called Jorge Lanz, one of the most important of all Nazi ideologists. Jorge Lanz von Liebenfels was an ex-Cistercian monk who published the magazine Ostara. After being expelled from his monastery, he formed his own Order of the New Templars. Adolf Hitler and other Nazis collected and read Ostara and thought of Lanz as a veritable guru. There's the front cover of Ostara, and as you can see, clearly shown there is a Knights Templar. Now, the master race, as they referred themselves to, these terms, we've become so enamored to them, we don't even think anymore what they really mean. Master race. Who are the racialists? Who are those who control the genes of mankind? Who are those who try to separate and segregate the human race based on genetics and eugenics and racial hygiene? Who were the original ones? We see only the Nazis. They're a modern rendition of this ancient problem. They were Satanists who practiced black magic, says Ravenscroft, author of The Spear of Destiny. This means that they were solely concerned with raising their consciousness by means of rituals to awareness of evil and non-human intelligences in the universe, and with achieving means of communication with these intelligences. Now, closer to home, when the tomb of Yale University, that's the tomb of the Skull and Bones secret fraternity, was raided by Christian students, the decor was almost purely Nazi in nature. Maltese crosses, swastikas, and so on were found therein. And the number 322, which is the lodge of the Skull and Bones Society, is actually the German lodge number of this fraternity. It is controlled by German secret societies such as the Illuminati and the OTO and the Thule. And Joel Bakan, in his fine book, The Corporation, says, in its July 1934 issue, Fortune magazine extolled the virtues of fascism and the economic miracles wrought by Mussolini. Lord Goldsborough, the man who produced the issue, wrote, the good journalist must recognize in fascism certain ancient virtues of the race, whether or not they happen to be fashionable in his own country. So there we have it, ties between modern American industrialists and politicians and ancient societies and German occultists. Now, have we been told all along that the ritual sacrifices have been going on? Let's look at the etymology. We've been told that there's a nuclear war. We've been told that there's an atomic war. What do these words actually refer to? What does the word nuclear or nucleus actually refer to? What does the word atomic actually refer to? Does it really refer to reds under the beds and SDI and bombs dropping at you from the skies? Or is it something much closer to home, something slightly more biological, something more of a Cold War, one that would never heat up at all? And what are the Star Wars? And now that the ritual centers have been designed and built, and now that the masses of the population live in the cities of the world, the next stage is easy. All the unrest, all the slaughter, all the mayhem, all the bloodletting, from the Holocaust to the assassinations. We have in Ireland, for instance, tremendous unrest there, constant unrest in Palestine, in Guyana, in Waco, in Heaven's Gate, in Columbine school disaster, in Oklahoma City bombing, or the Twin Towers, or the Gulf War. All these traumas visited upon members of the human race. In Waco, the great comedian Bill Hicks said, if child molestation is actually your concern, then how come we don't see Bradley tanks knocking down Catholic churches? Now, since the Second World War, the US has bombed 250 countries. That's actually since 1948, which was the time of the creation of the United Nations. Anthony J. Hilder of Radio Free World says there have been more wars since the creation of the United Nations in 1948 than from the beginning of time up until 1948. Now, who are the United Nations, and were they really created to instigate peace in the world anyway? Well, their history is that they were previously called the League of Nations, and they came into existence through Roosevelt's Bretton Woods Agreement. But before they were called the League of Nations, they were called the League to Enforce the Peace. Previous to that, they were called the American Society for the Judicial Settlement of International Disputes. Now, this society was created in 1920 by Theodore Marburg, and its first chairman was William Howard Taft of the Skull and Bones Society. Secretaries of War of the U.S. are commonly Skull and Bones members, right up to the modern day. And Geneva is home to the League of Nations and to the Bilderberger Group. Concerning the slaughter and mayhem, Count Leo Tolstoy, the great author, said that government is an association of men who do violence to the rest of us. How right he is. And Manly Palmer Hall, one of America's greatest and most beloved occultists, also a 33rd degree Mason, puts it this way: to repress rebellion is to maintain the status quo, a condition which binds the mortal creature in a state of intellectual or physical slavery. But it is impossible to chain man merely by slaving his body. The mind must also be held, and to accomplish this, fear is the accepted weapon. The common man must fear life, fear death, fear God, and fear devil, and fear most his overlords, the keepers of his destiny. So it goes for urban life. And now Aldous Huxley, in his book The Final Revolution, one of the people very much into control of the masses, writes, there will be, in the next generation or so, a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorships without tears, so to speak. Producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it, because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda, brainwashing, or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods. And this seems to be the final revolution. That's right. As the Nazis had a final solution for their victims, so these thinkers and potentates and politicians, they're working on the final solution for the rest of us. But we're going to enjoy it, of course. Now, one of the major occultists in Europe was called Count Cagliostro, and he was one of the individuals also working on the Stargate problem. His real name was Giuseppe Balsamo, and he was a ruthless and a very enigmatic character. And being a Freemason, he actually invented one of Freemasonry's rites. It's called Cagliostro's Egyptian rite. But this involved a virginal boy or girl as an oracle, or even as a priest. And these virgins were known in Masonic circles as the Columb, or the doves. So here we have Cagliostro's Egyptian rite, a rite that involves virginal boys or girls in the form of the priest or the oracle. But they're known by the name the doves. And the Spanish for that is Columb. So anybody remember Columbine High School and the sacrifice of the young children there? Were they oracles too, in some sort of Masonic rite? We have Applewhite and the priesthood of Saturn. Saturnian symbolism is also very prevalent in Freemasonry. And this particular Heaven's Gate cult, the very word Heaven's Gate, we already looked earlier at Saturn and the gate of the south, which is a correspondence of death, and the fact that they wore black attire, and the Nike logo. The Nike logo is actually the corner of the rings of Saturn, and the fact that the men in Heaven's Gate were castrated. Anyone who studied ancient mythology knows that Saturn and the sickle of Saturn and the castration of his father Uranus, all of these symbols coming out of the ancient world. Now, large doses of fear, trepidation, and agony were released during the 9/11 episode, not only from New York, but all over the world. This event was staged at the site of a powerful vortex or synchronic line. So yes, as part of the great rituals and traumas, we're not going to have just one event. We're going to have assassinations, we're going to have murders, we're going to have rapes and serial crimes. We're going to have Zodiac killers and Green River killers and night stalkers and all kinds of disaster. We're going to have children burned up with CS gas at Waco, and all other manner of atrocities that one could possibly think of, that the human mind in its depravity could come up with. 9/11 is just one of those events. But any of these events, if they're situated at the right place and at the right time, create waves that permeate into the earth grid and permeate the lives of individuals. That's what cities were originally designed for. There's nothing natural about a city. There's nothing natural about living in one. Assassinations like that of Diana, the moon goddess, on August 31st. And August 31st is the period when the constellation known as Virgo descends beneath the horizon. So the Virgin descending beneath the horizon signifies the time of sacrifice. In fact, August 31st, 100 years prior, was when Jack the Ripper killed his first virgin, or his first whore. Another ritual sacrifice. November 22nd, 1963. At Sagittarius, the point of Sagittarius, the famous 13th sign of the zodiac, is the assassination of John F. Kennedy at the junction of 3 roads on November 22nd. That's 11 for November and 22 for the day. That's 33. He was also shot at the 33rd meridian of the earth at the junction of 3 roads. And he was murdered at the period between the signs of Sagittarius and Scorpio. And this is known as the 13th sign of the zodiac. Only those who study the occult, esoteric form of astrology know this, the famous 13th sign of the zodiac. And the secret society, or the secret bodyguard, the secret police of meant to be protecting John F. K., referred to him by the code name the Traveler. But in fact, that's an ancient mythological name. Exactly at the point when the sun god descends into the underworld, he was known in all ancient times as the Traveler. Speaking of this kind of geometry, Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval write, the geographical latitude of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount lies between the 31st and 32nd degree parallels, with the latter passing just south of the Holy City. It has also been remarked that the Mother Lodge of the Scottish Rite Supreme Council of the 33rd degree was located in the city of Charleston in South Carolina, probably because the 33rd degree parallel passes right through it. So even though it may seem strange, even preposterous to us, these secret societies pay attention not only to sidereal time, not only the calendar dates, not only the movement of the luminaries and the stars, but also to the degrees of longitude and latitude of the earth, from the dropping of the atom bomb to assassinations here, to openings of buildings there. These sidereal times are very, very important, as the great scholars are now starting to find out. And this particular thing about the 33rd meridian, why are so many of the world's banks, why are so many of the world's wars, why are so many of the stately homes of the world, and specifically the banks, are situated on the 30th, between the 30th and 33rd parallel of the earth. But we have wars, and we have rumors of wars, and we have endless anxiety. Large doses of fear and confusion make excellent business, especially for the pharmaceutical monopolies. Consumption of antidepressants rose dramatically after the attack on the World Trade Center. As Emperor Caligula is meant to have said, let them hate us as long as they fear us. Fear, of course, as Huxley and as Manly Palmer Hall are saying, is the best way to control. Since love and fear can hardly exist together, says Machiavelli, and if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. So this is the kind of mentality in these new Atlanteans, the ones who seek to control us and keep us roped in, dumbed down, ignorant, impoverished, not to be made privy to what the masters are doing behind the scenes, behind the veil of government and national security. Now, F.T. Marinetti is a great study when it comes to studying mania. The founder of the Italian Futurism and a lifelong fascist, he was also one of the most influential personages in the history of modern art. In his Futurist Manifesto of 1909, he says, "War is beautiful because it initiates the dreamt-of metallization of the human body. War is beautiful because it enriches a flowering meadow with fiery orchids of machine guns. War is beautiful because it combines the gunfire, the cannonades, the ceasefire, the scents, and the stench of putrefaction into a symphony. We will glorify war, the world's only hygiene. Militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of freedom, brings beautiful ideas worth dying for, and scorn for women. We will destroy the museums, libraries, academies of every kind. We will fight moralism, feminism, every opportunistic or utilitarian cowardice." Makes one think of the movie Dr. Strangelove, this kind of mania loose in the world. Not some psychotic though, not somebody who's been locked up in a asylum somewhere. These are the top thinkers of the world, people whose thoughts and manifestos change how we think and act. Herman Kahn, in his On Thermonuclear War in 1960, calmly considers whether or not a death toll of 50 million human beings would be an acceptable, quote-unquote, statistic to ensure that democracy prevails. Jordan Maxwell and some other scholars who study the astrological cycles and chart what these evil archies are up to, and once you know what they're into, then you can sort of follow what they're up to and get ahead of the game. We've come to understand that we're in what we call the Saturnalian period, or what they call the Saturnalian period, when chaos and debauchery is permissible. We're in what the Hindus call the Kal age, and what also might be called the Dionysian age, when all forms of debauchery and depravity are let loose upon the world. This is the period when all kinds of virtue and morality, as the ancient texts were saying, are thought of as vices. Julian Huxley, in the preface to Brave New World, says, "As political and economic freedom diminishes, sexual freedom tends to compensatingly increase, and the dictator will do well to encourage that freedom, in conjunction with the freedom to daydream under the influence of dope, movies, and radio. It will help to reconcile his subjects to their servitude, which is not their fate." In Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, he writes, "Sensual pleasures programmed into people as infants through hypnopedic messages repeated thousands of times as they slept. These messages encouraged sexual promiscuity, attendance at mass entertainments, and the ingestion of drugs for any and every unpleasant feeling or little distress." The idea here is not to have people actually have more sex, but to engender frustration that they're not able to. In George Orwell's 1984, An Animal Farm, he says, "The past is completely eliminated. History is revised. Books are destroyed. Without print media, there is no evidence that anything has been different. Even keeping diaries is forbidden. People are expected to absorb and accept the new information delivered by the television sets, even if it directly contradicts the news of a month ago. Since it is impossible to prove the contradiction, it is useless to try to resist." And is this not the exact situation we find ourselves in today, where people not only believe the media, but in believing it, they're filled with contradictions? But who stands up to write those contradictions? If something on the media repeats and repeats and repeats the same message, eventually 80% of the population just blithely accept it. In the book Being Human, we read, "When faced with a life-threatening situation, the reptilian hindbrain, the most primitive part of the human brain, switches off all activity except that which keeps us alive. It sends the subconscious message, 'Do not move, breathe, or blink, or you will be seen and attacked. But as Hesiod, and the ancient Greek playwright in 8th century BC, he writes, "The gods keep mankind ignorant of the ways of living, else one would do enough in one day to last a year." In Job 12, the Bible, we read, "He increaseth the nations and destroyeth them. He enlargeth the nations and straighteneth them again." In Job 12, "He taketh away the heart of the chief of the people of the earth, and causeth them to wander in a wilderness where there is no way. They grope in the dark, without light, and him maketh to stagger like a drunken man." So we have it in the age of Dionysus, the Kal age. And who are the philosophers who brought this about? Well, Thomas Malthus, in his own words, says, in his essay on population, "Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. We should crowd more people into the houses and court the return of the plague. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases, and those benevolent but mistaken men who have thought that they were doing a service to mankind by projecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders. If by these and similar means the annual mortality were increased, we might possibly, every one of us, marry at the age of puberty, and yet few be absolutely starved." When we come to eugenics and Charles Darwin, he writes in his own words, "Excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed." Eugenics, which was selective breeding or racial hygiene, is not, however, a Nazi or a German phenomena, but a British and American one. Hundreds of people were systemically and legally sterilized in the United States from 1907 on. The most influential eugenicist was Sir Francis Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin. He was an honorary president of the Eugenics Society for several years. His successor was Major Leonard Darwin, son of Charles Darwin, and it was he who strongly promoted the eradication of the unfit. The first U.S. Eugenics Society was headed by Averell Harriman's mother. It was also funded by the royals, as was the entire Harriman dynasty. Ernst Rudin, Hitler's eugenics expert and chief engineer, was a guest of Mrs. Harriman in America before the advent of the Second World War. In 1905, Dr. Ernst Rudin founded a German eugenics society called the Society for Racial Hygiene. Later he changed the name, adding the word suggested by Francis Galton, the Society for Racial Hygiene, that is, eugenics. In 1925, Leonard Darwin wrote an article for the Journal of the Eugenics Society, the Eugenics Review, pushing the idea of locking up everyone whose genes might be considered defective. To save the human race, he said, force or compulsion would be necessary in many cases. He promoted a policy that he called segregation, but he did not mean segregating whites from blacks. He meant separating the fit from the unfit. Compulsion is now permitted if applying to criminals, lunatics, and mental defectives, and this principle must be extended to all who, by having offspring, would seriously damage future generations, he argued. The leaders of the progressive movement in Britain also supported negative eugenics. The people who had founded the London School of Economics, that's Sidney and Beatrice Webb, were also leaders of the Fabian Society. The Fabian Society later became one of Britain's major political parties, the Labour Party. As early as 1909, the Fabians, led by the Webbs, said, "What we as eugenicists have got to do is to scrap the old poor law with its indiscriminate relief of the destitute as such, and replace it by an intelligent policy of so altering the social environment as to discourage or prevent the multiplication of those irrevocably below the national minimum of fitness." In 1930, a Fabian leader, Archibald Church, introduced a bill for eugenic sterilization. So here we have the Fabians, here we have top politicians, here we have the founder of evolution theory, the elites of British society, deciding who will live and who will not, and the manner in which they will administer the torture to the unfit. The Fabian Society itself was founded in 1883 and played a catalytic role, preaching the inevitability of gradualness in the movement towards a socialist society, taking their name from the Roman warrior Fabius, who learned to wait patiently before striking a fatal blow against Hannibal. In America, John Foster Dulles, Senator and Secretary of State under Eisenhower, has this to say: "It is only by eliminating the lower members of the human race that the higher average is maintained." And Jacques Cousteau, UNESCO courier, on November 1991 said, "The United Nations goal is to reduce population selectively by encouraging abortion, forced sterilization, and control human reproduction, and regards 2/3 of the human population as excess baggage, with 350,000 people to be eliminated per day." And the master of them all, Bertrand Russell, in his Impact of Science on Society, had this to say: "At present, the population of the world is increasing at about 58,000 per diem. War so far has had no very great effect on this increase, which continued throughout each of the world wars. War has hitherto been disappointing in this respect, but perhaps bacteriological war may prove effective. If a Black Death could spread throughout the world in every generation, survivors could procreate freely without making the world too full. The state of affairs might be unpleasant, but what of it?" We have Prince Philip, quoted in the Deutsche Presse Agentur in August 1988, said, "In the event I am reborn, I would like to return as a deadly virus in order to contribute something to solve overpopulation." Now, the Institute of Human Virology, we read that according to top pharmacologist Dr. Robert B. Strecker, MD, PhD, the leading scientist of the project, that AIDS virus was created at Fort Detrick, but was based on research first conducted at the Lebedev Institute near Moscow, which was founded by the world's leading virologist, Gurvich. The number of those infected doubles every month. Over 23 million Americans are already affected. In the Strecker Memorandum, in the 30s and 40s, the Public Health Service openly experimented and monitored black men infected with syphilis in Tuskegee, Alabama. Even after penicillin was discovered, these men remained infected and were not treated. Hence, their wives and sons were likewise infected. These incidents are recorded in detail in the book Bad Blood by James Jones. Between 1959 and 1970, there were over 300 biological experiments conducted on U.S. citizens unbeknownst to them. The extent of the program is revealed in the book A Higher Form of Killing by Paxman and Harris. That's from Dr. Robert Strecker's The Strecker Memorandum. Now here it is on DVD. This Dr. Robert Strecker, conclusively proves that AIDS was vector-borne, that AIDS was a man-made designer disease to create havoc in the world, exactly according to the policies of Bertrand Russell and Aldous Huxley and his coterie. This is absolute compulsory viewing. The Strecker Memorandum by Dr. Robert Strecker. He was one of the first people to work on the AIDS virus and knows everything there is to know about it. In The Final Revolution, Aldous Huxley says, "It seems to me perfectly in the cards that a euphoric drug, far more efficient and less harmful than alcohol, may be produced. And if this should be introduced into every bottle of Coca-Cola, then clearly, as I ventured to point out more than 25 years ago in Brave New World, this would become an incredibly powerful instrument in the hands of a dictator. What is becoming, I think, quite clear now is that dictatorships of the future probably will not be based on terror, as the dictatorships of Hitler and Stalin. Terror is an extremely wasteful, stupid, and inefficient method of controlling people. In Brave New World, the distribution of this mysterious drug, which I call the soma, was a plank in the political platform. A Dr. Wright refers to inoculation against smallpox in the British Isles as an ancient practice. And a citizen of Wales, aged 99 years old, states that inoculations had been known and used during his entire lifetime, but that she got smallpox through her inoculation. In Birmingham, England, from 1871 to 1874, there were 7,706 cases of smallpox. Out of these, 6,795 had been vaccinated against the disease. A select committee of the Privy Council convened to inquire into the Vaccination Act of 1867, as 97.5% of those vaccinated died of the disease. Now, Dr. Charles Crichton, in 1884, he is asked to write an article for the Encyclopedia Britannica on vaccination. After much research internationally, he concludes that vaccination constituted a gross superstition. In 1896, Italian professor Carlo Ruta states that vaccination is a worldwide delusion and an unscientific practice with consequences measured today with tears and sorrow without end. Joseph Lister introduced sanitation to the surgery and hospital, but was fiercely resisted by leading surgeons and doctors. The British Medical Association dedicated itself to attacking his name, reputation, and theories. In 1850, a British physician reads paper detailing the microscopic examination of food products, revealing that all food products examined in Britain were adulterated with foreign substances, including chemicals. W.B. Clark from the New York Press in 1909 says, cancer was practically unknown until the cowpox vaccination began to be introduced. He says, I have seen 200 cases of cancer, and I never saw a case of cancer in an unvaccinated person. On the question of fluoride, in 1943, researchers from the U.S. Public Health Service examined the health of the residents of Bartlett, Texas, to see if the 8 parts per million of fluoride in their drinking water was affecting their health. It was checked again in 1953. They find that the death rate in Bartlett was 3 times higher than a neighboring town which contained only 0.4 parts per million of the fluoride. Dr. James W. Wardner, in his book Unholy Alliances, says, the London Office of Strategic Affairs, that's the OSS from which developed the CIA, was run by David K. E. Bruce, an employee of Averell Harriman from the 1920s. Through Bruce and other connections, Averell Harriman dominated all American intelligence functions in wartime Britain. David Bruce was the husband of a Pittsburgh Mellon heiress. Allen Dulles had been the player for the Mellons' big international oil ventures, and eventually the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell took over the management of the entire Mellon family fortune. It was through the Mellons that fluoride began to be promoted and dispensed into the America's water supply. Now, Ghislaine Langtot, in her book The Medical Mafia, writes, at a CIA hearing, Dr. Gottlieb, a cancerologist, admitted having dispersed in 1960 a large quantity of viruses in the Congo River in Zaire to pollute and contaminate all the people who used the river as their source of water. Dr. Gottlieb was named to be the head of the National Cancer Institute. François Mitterrand, the president of France, says, the health of citizens is a commodity which is bought and sold. And mind control advocate Dr. Jose Delgado, in his book Physical Control of the Mind Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society, simply puts it this way: man does not have the right to develop his own mind. Now, the annual death toll from synthetic prescription drugs, both from the correctly prescribed and the incorrectly prescribed, amounts to about 231,000 deaths every year. To put this into perspective, this is the equivalent of a World Trade Center disaster every week for over a year and a half, or the crash of 2 fully loaded 747 aircraft every day of the year. Drug deaths caused by physicians, the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States. It is far ahead of accidents, drunk driving, homicides, airline accidents, as well as all other disease. Jimmy Carter says, doctors collectively have done more to block adequate medical care for people of this country than any other single group. And Linus Pauling, the Nobel laureate, says, everyone should know that the war on cancer is largely a fraud. Now it turns out that the term or word Medici, refers to the 13th century Florentine patrician family who became one of the most powerful bankers as well as patrons of the arts and who provided many tyrannical popes. This word, the Medici, actually comes from that, meaning medical doctors. So again, here we have the age-old connection, coming down from the Venetians, coming down from the Phoenicians, coming down from the ancient Sumerians. We have the families related, descended by blood from these ancient sources. And they're still up to their business, right down into modern times, massacring, creating rituals, treating people as if they're just cattle ready for sacrifice. Alice Bailey, an occultist and head of the Lucius Trust, she says, behind the division of humanity stand those enlightened ones whose right and privilege it is to watch over human evolution and to guide the destinies of men. This they do through the implanting of ideas in the minds of the world thinkers, so that these ideas in due time receive recognition and eventually become controlling factors in human life. They train the members of the new group of world servers in the task of changing these ideas into ideals. These in turn become the desired objectives of the thinkers and are then taught to the powerful middle class and worked up into world forms of governments or religion, thus forming the basis of the new world order. And Sidney West, the leader of the Fabian Society that later became the Labour Party of England, has this to say about the whole gig. To play those millions of minds, to watch them slowly respond to unseen stimulus, to guide their aspirations without their knowledge, all this, whether in high capacities or in humble, is a big and endless game of chess of ever extraordinary excitement. So-called philanthropist John D. Rockefeller, in his occasional letter number 1 of the General Educational Board, has this to say: in our dreams we have limitless resources, and people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. Unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill on a grateful and responsive rule of folk. The task we set before ourselves is a very beautiful one, to train these people as we find them to a perfectly ideal life just where they are. And Major John Rawling Rees of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, a major mind control syndicate in England, says this: the patient must remain unaware of the specific intentions and purposes of the doctor administrating the treatment. Building a society in which it is possible for any member of any social group to be treated without resort to legal means, and even if they do not desire such treatment. It should be clear by now, at this stage, that we have in fact an official history and we have an occult history of the world, occult history of the ancient world, and we also have a occult history of America. Arthur S. Miller of George Washington University says, those who formally rule take their signals and commands not from the electorate as a body, but from a small group of men plus a few women. This group will be called the establishment. It exists even though that existence is stoutly denied. It is one of the secrets of the American social order. A second secret is the fact that the existence of the establishment, the ruling class, is not supposed to be discussed. Now, in the American Oath of Allegiance, we hear reference to protecting America from enemies both foreign and domestic, which implies, does it not, that there can be domestic enemies? Well, we can be sure that there are plenty of domestic enemies. Let's take a look and find out who they are. One of the most powerful of all the secret societies given the agenda and operating in the world is known by the name of the Illuminati. There's terms that they use, these secret societies, and then there's terms that their historians and critics also use, terms that they use within the lodges and terms and names that people on the outside know. But the Illuminati is a very powerful organization. On the left is a picture of its creator, Adam Weishaupt. And Adam Weishaupt, after his passing on, the mantle went to the Italian revolutionary Giuseppe Mazzini, and Giuseppe Mazzini passed it on to the American Albert Pike. whose picture is on the right there. Albert Pike is the creator of the Scottish Rite Freemasonic system, or at least the bringer to America of the Scottish Rite Freemasonic system. Now, Adam Weisschap's symbol, the original symbol of the Illuminati, was the pyramid with the eye at the top, and the term New World Order, or Novus Ordo Seclorum, around the bottom of the pyramid. That was the symbol that was found on the documents of the Illuminati and is now on the American $1 bill. The Illuminati was officially founded on May 1st, 1776, and America's official birthday is July 4th, 1776. Interestingly, Adolf Hitler's second book was called the New World Order. Now, this term New World Order is found at the bottom of the pyramid. It is another secret society slogan. It is not a political slogan. Adolf Hitler's first book was Mein Kampf, and the second one was the World Order, or the New World Order. Now, Masons work in very ingenious ways in order to conceal their identity. If you take the symbol of the pyramid and draw around it, take a ruler and draw around it a six-pointed star or hexagram or Star of David, which is easy to do because the pyramid is already the upward pointing triangle, you will find that at the vertices, at the apexes of the Star of David, that's at the 6 points, it spells out the word M-A-S-O-N, that's Mason. And of course it shows a pyramid, which Masons build. George Washington is seen here standing in the Masonic Hall with a Masonic G above his head, and he's wearing the Masonic apron. So George Washington and many other elites and presidents and so forth are members of these secret fraternities. Everyone knows about the Lincoln Memorial, but travelers and tourists are not as aware that round the corner from that is a very strange, to say the least, image of George Washington, one of the founding fathers. He's seen here naked to the waist, his arms in this mysterious pose. Of course, it's mysterious to tourists. It's not mysterious to members of secret societies, because they would recognize this pose. It is an occult symbol. Here is the god worshipped by the Knights Templars, Baphomet. Open any book on the occult and you'll usually see this symbol of the deity stripped to the waist with the hands in that pose. Baphomet is the god of the Freemasons and of the Rosicrucians. Here's an image of Baphomet with the rose cross and the serpent on the globe, being worshipped by the members of the fraternity. And in the book of Acts, we have a reference to Satan. I am the offspring of the serpent nature and a corrupter's son. I am the son of he who sits upon the throne and has dominion over the creation beneath the heavens. So the serpents have dominion over the heavens and over the earth. Here is the original symbol that was meant to be on the dollar bill before they came up with the eagle. It was actually a triangle surrounded by serpents. America, as we saw earlier, is literally the land of the serpents. They probably thought that would be too obvious and settled for other symbols instead, like the eagle. Here is the first U.S. flag, which shows the stars, again Sirius, and the all-seeing eye radiating outward. So the eye, the Freemasonic symbols of the stars and the all-seeing eye and the pyramidical shape were very much in the minds of the original founding fathers. Now the number 13 appears on the dollar bill quite a lot. There's 13 levels of the pyramid, and the 13, which appears on the dollar bill, refers directly to the serpent. In the book of Revelations, it's chapter 13 that the dragon and his destructive power are introduced, but that destructive power involves the use of money. In Revelation 13 it says, he also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or upon his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. Now the Declaration of Independence was signed by 56 men, over 50 of whom were Masons, some Grand Masters. Their original meeting place was none other than the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, which Daniel Webster said was the headquarters of the American Revolution. So the whole of the American Revolution starts in a tavern which bears the name the Green Dragon. We wonder if that green dragon was swallowing a human being. Now, all cults, all fraternities, all churches, all denominations have their symbols. We know the symbols, and we know what we're looking at, whether it's a church, a synagogue, a mosque, whether it's a policeman, or whether it's a fireman, or whether it's a nurse. We know things by their symbols. So fascism, what are the symbols of fascism? One might think it's the swastika. Actually, it is not. The symbols of international fascism are much older than that. And the key symbol, the cardinal symbol of the fascist movements of the world, is a bundle of rods with a hatchet in the middle of them. This is called the fasce, or the fasces. It's an old Roman symbol, but it even predates the Romans. Where do we find it? On the back of the Congress room. The Freemasonic monopoly of government positions continued for at least the first 100 years of United States history. According to a 1924 census, even in that year, the Senate had a membership which was 60% Freemason. But what worries me more is why, of all the symbols that you could possibly choose, the symbols for international fascism are there in the Senate room at the back. Now, James W. Wardner, in his book on Holy Alliances, says, "Our first president was a Mason, sworn into office by the Grand Master of New York on a Bible taken from a Masonic altar, that of St. John's Lodge No. 1. The Bible used in the ceremony was brought there by John Morton, Marshal of the Day from St. John's Lodge, of which he was the worshipful master. Thus was laid the cornerstone of our country, and forever of our government. This same Bible, used for Washington's inauguration, was used to swear in Masonic presidents Warren Harding in 1921 and Dwight Eisenhower in 1953. And what the good doctor fails to tell you is that when George Bush, in more recent times, asked for his Bible, he specifically asked for 3 Bibles, the Masonic 3, and laid his hand on 3 Bibles, and that is another known Masonic symbol. Well, if you got allegiances, you certainly have. George Washington, here is another statue of George Washington, and the caption under the bust, under the name, says Freemason and First President. Now, I don't know about you. In fact, I'm not even an American citizen. I'm from Ireland. But yet I would take offense to that statement. Because what does it say? Let's read it together. It says George Washington, Freemason and First President. Now, maybe it's just me, but perhaps that should be the other way around. But no, these chaps have allegiances. And you see, that's the problem. That's the conundrum with domestic enemies. If you've got allegiances behind the veil, then what good are your promises and your allegiances in the public domain? If you have your fingers crossed behind your back, so to speak, what good are your promises? Well, from their own works, here's a little book that Freemasons use. This is just one of their little manifesto books that they're all given. It's called the Duncan's Ritual. The Duncan's Ritual of Freemasonry. It's given to neophytes so that they can learn about their rituals, and it's full of interesting pictures to show them what to do when they're in the lodge. And in books just like this one, in the Duncan's Ritual, you find captions like this. You find instructions, and you find oaths. I will aid and assist a companion Royal Archmason when engaged in any difficulty, and espouse his cause, whether it be right or wrong. A companion Royal Archmason's secrets shall remain as secure and inviolable in my breast as in his own. Murder and treason not accepted. Here at the G7 summit, you've got the whole picture in one. You've got the Illuminati pyramid in the center with its spokes radiating out. And who are the gang of criminals sitting around it? We've got Francis Mitterrand, we've got Bill Clinton of America and Tony Blair, and other minions of the Atlantean warlocks. And the G, the G7, the G8. The G is the famous Masonic G, seen on every Masonic lodge. And what is a summit? A summit meeting, a peak meeting. We're meeting on the floor of the house. These are Masonic terms. Pick up a book on it and find out. In my book and also in the presentation, Weapons of Mass Deception Behind the New World Order, I go very much into this. It's part of the Origins and Oracles series. We show the actual connections between the Bush dynasty and the fraternities of Freemasonry and the Illuminati. So we've taken a little bit of time there to look at the ingenuity of the machinations of our hidden masters, our controllers. We've looked at why they're motivated to do what they do. We've looked at how they do it a little bit. But have we really proven that these individuals are not just money-grubbing and power-mongering individuals driven by greed? Have we really proven that they do in fact have bloodlines and connections to the ancient past? Let's take another look at that whole question of lineage and bloodline. Peter Tompkins, in his book Secret of the Great Pyramid, quotes the great Manly Palmer Hall, who said, "Not only were many of the founders of the U.S. Masons, but they received aid from a secret and august body existing in Europe, which helped them to establish the United States for," he says, "a peculiar and particular purpose known only to the initiated few." But the conspiracy is an old one. It's not something new. Sir Thomas More, in 1478, in the 1500s, almost at the time of the Tudors, he writes, "Everywhere do I perceive a certain conspiracy of rich men seeking their own advantage under that name and pretext of the Commonwealth." So here's the Sir Thomas More, friend of Henry Tudor, clearly showing us that we have two realities here. We've got the fronts that these people hide behind, be it the Commonwealth or communism or eugenics or Nazism or fascism. These isms and ologies are merely fronts. They're easy to create. But what goes on behind these fronts? What goes on behind the scenes? Now, many books have been written charting this concept of bloodline. It's become a cottage industry almost, going into the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail and the legends of the Holy Family. And this is the book that started it all, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail by Begent and Lay and Lincoln. And it was a bestseller, and it's a book well worth reading because, again, as a bestseller, it went into the subject of secret societies and their ancestry and how they operate in the world behind closed doors and also out in the open. But unless we learn to see it, unless we become literate to the symbols and the emblems that they use, and something about also their philosophies, they could be operating right in front of us and we wouldn't know it. We might even be conspiring in helping them. William Bramley, in his masterpiece, Gods of Eden, writes, "The Sumerians state that the first human kings on earth were the offspring of the custodial rulers who mated with the human women. Those matings entitled the half-human offspring to become the early monarchs on the earth." Now, the phoneme for a king is Rex. But RX is also the symbol that refers to royalty and also to the Rose Cross, or the Rosicrucians. And some people think, like Lawrence Gardner, they're trying to establish the fact that this RX was in fact the famous mark of Cain. And Cain, as we know from this presentation, is the serpent. We also have the symbols of the red carpet. The red carpet, which is commonly used by the royals, is a symbol of the bloodline. Bloodline is very important to the royals. And the rolling of the red runner that the queen or the king or the dignitaries walk on is their symbol. That's where it comes from. It's old Semitic tradition that we are the bloodline that starts in the past and goes through us and continues into the future. So when you happen to see certain politicians in America, those who are meant to have fought wars against these dynasties and monarchs of the old world, still walking on the red carpet, still sitting on the red square, we've got some questions. In subversive use of sacred symbolism, presentation of the Origins and Oracles series, we go into that more deeply, what the symbol of the red carpet really entails and why it's so used in the world by those who are not officially connected to the royal dynasties of old. And the handshake and the red carpet, it's a one-party state. Heads they win, tails we lose. A one-party state. The same occult symbols, the same occult agenda. A carefully crafted dialectic. And they've all got allegiances. Just like any mafioso or gang that has its rules, its regulations, and its codes, so do the heads of state and the members of the elites. In the emerald tablets of Thoth, the Atlantean, we read, "Speak I of ancient Atlantis. Speak of the days of the kingdom of shadows. Speak of the coming of the children of shadows. Out of the great deep they were called by the wisdom of the earthman. In the form of man they moved amongst us, but only to sight were they as men. Serpent-headed when the glamour was lifted. Crept they into councils, taking the form, were like unto men, slaying by their arts the chiefs of the kingdoms, taking their form and ruling over man, to destroy man and rule in his place." In the book of Enoch, chapter 15, "And now the giants, who are produced from the spirits and flesh, shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, because they are born from men and from the holy watchers in their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on the earth, and evil spirits they shall be called. And the spirits of the giants will afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth and cause trouble. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men and against the women." Dr. Stephen Holler in Jung and the Lost Gospels, he writes, "The star angels and other ruling spirits appear as tyrannical, limiting agencies in this Gnostic view. They are usurpers who lord it over humanity and creation in order to enhance their own self-importance and glory. It is incumbent upon the knower to realize this and to extricate himself from the grasp of these powers whenever possible." Again, from Hermes Trismegistus, AD 150, "So the gods will depart from mankind, a grievous thing, and only evil angels will remain, who will mingle with men and drive the poor wretches by main force into all manner of reckless crime, into wars and robberies and frauds, and all things hostile to the nature of the soul. Darkness will be preferred to light, and death will be thought more profitable than life. The pious will be deemed insane, and the impious wise. The madman will be thought a brave man, and the wicked will be esteemed as good." We have the story even coming out of the scriptures. I'm reminded of Christ saying, "The Pharisees and the scribes have taken the keys of knowledge and have hidden them. They have not entered, nor have they allowed those who want to enter to do so. As for you, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves." So here we have the message that those who are in the bastions and the corridors of power, be they of a religious disposition or of a autocratic political disposition, they bar the way. They bar the way to us psychologically. They bar the way to us spiritually. And they certainly bar the way to us materially. They don't recognize all human beings as equal. They recognize themselves as an overclass, an elite, as God-men, as royalty. And the rest of us, nothing more than their dispensable, disposable servants. Jordan Maxwell, in his Secret Societies and Toxic Religion, says, "Plato said that the price society pays for non-involvement in political affairs is to be ruled by evil men. When have we ever been ruled by evil men, if not now?" And here we have Joseph de Maistria again, in his St. Petersburg Dialogues, letting us know how the game works. "Who is this inexplicable being who, when there are so many agreeable, lucrative, honest, and even honorable professions to choose among, to which a man can exercise his skill or his powers, has chosen that of torturing or killing his own kind? Is there not something in them that is peculiar and alien to our nature? Myself, I have no doubt about this. He is made like us externally. He is born like us all. But he is an extraordinary being. He is created like a law unto himself. Now all grandeur, power, all subordination to authority rests on the executioner. He is the horror and the bond of human association. Remove this incomprehensible agent from the world, and at that very moment, order gives way to chaos, thrones topple, and society disappears. Now, talking about bloodline, the fact is, as is now slowly coming to light, that at least 34 American presidents go back to European aristocratic families. These facts are concealed because these royal elites have children born and raised in unofficial families. That's right. At Hampton Court Hospital, the nurses there well know. They have it happen quite regularly. But all over the world it happens. The male heads of the royal dynasties are not just mating with or bonding with the one that is the girl next door or the one that the public sees them being married to. They have unofficial families, whole families whose job it is to breed the offspring of the kings of the world and the princes of the world, and to raise them in private, behind the veil. This is one of the great secrets of royalty, and under a different name. And then these children, records are kept on them, and very detailed records, and then they're sent to be the head of this bank and the head of that university and the head of this think tank. And then we sit and wonder why nothing changes and why none of these individuals ever breaks the code. Well, why should they? They're all bonded by blood. In an American context, the picture is unbelievable. Al Gore, for instance, one of the top politicians of the United States of America, contender to the presidency, is actually a descendant of Edward I. He's also cousin of former U.S. President Richard Nixon. He is descendant of the Roman emperors Louis II, Charles II, and Louis I, and is therefore also a direct descendant of Charlemagne, the 8th century emperor. The problem is that Gore's Charlemagne links also make him a cousin of George W. Bush. And don't we remember Bill Clinton running off in the latter days of his presidency to receive something called the Charlemagne Medal of Honor? Why? Charlemagne is the man who opened the West. Is Bill Clinton and George Bush the people who are closing the West, signing the death warrant on the middle class? George W. Bush is closely related to every European monarch on or off the throne, and has kinship with every member of Britain's royal family, the House of Windsor. He is the 13th cousin, note that number, the 13th cousin of Britain's Queen Mother, and of her daughter Queen Elizabeth, and is the 13th cousin once removed from the heir of the throne, Prince Charles. Bush's family tree can be documented as far back as early as the 15th century. He is a direct descent from Henry III and from Henry VIII's sister, Mary Tudor. There you go, there's that Tudor connection, who was also the wife of Louis XI of France. He is also descended from Charles II of England. But strange of all is that he and his own wife, Barbara Bush, are related to the same British monarch. The Kennedys married into British royalty. The girl of the family married some Duke of Buckinghamshire or whatever, or Duke of Marlborough, one of the most elite royal aristocratic figures of England. Now, it is hardly a secret that George W. Bush has an impressive family tree. His father was president, his grandfather, Prescott Bush, was a U.S. senator from Connecticut, and his brother Jeb is governor of Florida. But the Republican candidate for president has a richer political pedigree than the immediate family that gathers for Christmas dinners and birthday celebrations. They are, in fact, related to 16 U.S. presidents, a slew of British monarchs, and even the American Indian Princess Pocahontas. Gary Boyd Roberts, a prominent genealogist at the New England Historic Genealogical Society, documented the remarkable Bush lineage in his little notice book, Ancestors of American Presidents. According to Roberts, the list consists of George Washington, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, Grover Cleveland, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and George Herbert Walker Bush. all connected by blood. The Bush family, especially George Herbert Walker Bush, is directly connected to Prescott Sheldon Bush, back through Samuel Prescott Bush, back through Hannah Ruck in the 1700s, back to Anna Marbury in the 1500s, back to Eleanor de Buchan in the 1300s, and through Princess Elizabeth Plantagenet of the 1200s, back to King Edward I Longshanks. King Edward I, known to every Scot, considered the hammer of the Scot, and if you're in Scotland or Ireland, don't mention Edward I Longshanks. But we find out that the American president is basically directly linked to him. Tyrants all. And David Icke, Alice in Wonderland and the World Trade Center disaster, he says that Father George and wife Barbara are both descendants of Godefroy de Bouillon, who in 1099 led European noblemen in the successful crusade to recapture Jerusalem from the Islamic faith and moved into the king's palace at Temple Mount. Godefroy de Bouillon was the first king of Jerusalem and Duke of Lower Lorraine, a major region for the Illuminati bloodline. I bring out several times to audiences that Martin Luther King was shot in a motel called the Lorraine Motel, and the study of Lorraine and the symbols of Lorraine, the double cross, is a central study in the study of Freemasonry. But here we have Godefroy de Bouillon leading crusades. Where have we heard that one before? So when George W. Bush, a descendant of the de Bouillon through his mother and father, talked of a crusade against Islamic terrorism, this was no slip of the tongue, as was reported. The strange fact is, however, that of the 7 major Christian crusades, only one of them was won, the first. All the others were massive defeats by the Islamic forces. Earlier in the program we read from the Plantagenet King James I, the utter hubris and contempt that he had for the people's revolution, the people's revolt, and how he talked about vengeance from the skies and how God was mustering strange clouds of pestilence on their behalf, and that they should not raise their lowly eyes to him, and that the only thing that they would be allowed is to serve him and keep their lives. This hubris, of course, stretches down through James Stuart, the 6th King of Scotland and England, but is strangely reminiscent of the attitude that George W. Bush took in the first presidency when talking to the media about his dictatorship. But James Stuart said, "The state of monarchy is the most supreme thing upon earth, for kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself are called gods. For if you will consider the attributes of God, you shall see how they agree in the person of a king. To dispute what God does is blasphemy. So it is sedition in subjects to dispute what a king may do at the height of his power. I would not have you meddle with such ancient rights of mine as I have received from my predecessors." Well, now, according to what I've been advocating here, we know who those predecessors were. As a historian and philosopher, Marcus Tullius Cicero wrote, "A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and he carries his banners openly. But the traitor moves among those within the gates freely, his sly whispers rustling through the galleys, heard in every hall of government itself. For the traitor appears not a traitor. He speaks in the accents familiar to his victims, and wears their face and their garment, and he appeals to the baseness that lies deep in the hearts of all men. He rots the soul of a nation. He works secretly and unknown in the night to undermine the pillars of a city. He infects the body politic so that it can no longer resist. A murderer is less to be feared." Dr. Johannes Koppel, the former German Defense Ministry official and advisor to former NATO Secretary General Manfred Werner, he writes of these secret societies, and he says that the interests behind the Bush administration, such as the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, founded by Brzezinski for David Rockefeller, and the Bilderberger Group, have prepared for and are now moving to implement open world dictatorship within the next 5 years. New York City Mayor John Hylan in 1922 has this to say: "The real menace of our republic is this invisible government, which like a giant octopus sprawls its slimy length over city, state, and nation. Like the octopus of real life, it operates under cover of a self-created screen. At the head of this octopus are the Rockefeller Standard Oil interests and a small group of powerful banking houses generally referred to as the international bankers. The little coterie of powerful international bankers virtually run the United States government for their own selfish purposes. They practically control both political parties." George Bush is on record to say, "I never apologize for the United States of America. Never. And I don't care what the facts are." The attitude can be summed up as, don't presume to judge us. We don't live by your rules. You live by ours. If we turn to the situation in England, we find something very similar. Let's look at Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister of England in 1957. He becomes Prime Minister after Churchill and Anthony Eden. But he was uncle by marriage to the Duke of Devonshire. In 1962, the journalist Anthony Sampson wrote in Anatomy of Britain, in which he presented an elaborate family tree showing that Macmillan was related to the President of the United States, that was Kennedy, the British ambassador to Washington, which was David Ormsby Gore at that time. He was related to the Secretary for War, Julian Emery, the editors of the Observer and the Times Magazine, that was Lord Astor, no less, the Governor of the Bank of England, and 35 members of his own government. His wife was a Devonshire, and Macmillan promoted many of her relatives while Prime Minister. He was the grandson of Daniel Macmillan, the founder of Macmillan Publishing Company. He held illustrious positions such as Minister of Housing, Minister of Defense, Foreign Secretary, and Chancellor of the Exchequer. Good job if you can get it. And here's the other side. Presidential running mate John Kerry has got blue blood also, according to Burke's Peerage, and they should know. The Burke's Peerage is the book that has been kept since the Tudor dynasty by one single family on the genealogy of all the royals all over the world. And in fact, it was the editor, or it was the latest keeper of that book, a kind of a who's who, that noticed this pattern relating to the American presidents. So here we have the aristocrats themselves revealing the facts, and then it hit the investigative journalists who brought it to public light. Senator John Kerry has blue blood from all the royal houses of Europe, with even more titled relations than President Bush. Burke's Peerage, which researches the genealogy, said the Democratic presidential candidate traces descent through his mother, Rosemary Forbes, to the royal houses of Albania, England, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Russia, Byzantine, Persia, that's Iran, and France. Forbes was descended from William Forbes, the Laird of New, and extended family that included many baronets. It is via this family that the Democratic candidate is descended from Henry II, the King of England, and father of Richard the Lionheart, who was the leader of the Third Crusade in 1189. By contrast, Bush is related to Queen Elizabeth II, 20 British dukes, and many European princes. President Bush, Princess Diana, and Winston Churchill are also distantly related. In fact, Kerry and Bush are also cousins 9 times removed. In the very first part of this program, we looked at the little Celtic figurines, the little Celtic effigies that turn up in Ireland. And of course, they had the skull and bones motif. We find that the skull and bones was used by the Nazis. We find it was used by the English regiment, the Black Brunswickers. And now we find it on the pirates. And we find it later in the fraternities of the Ivy League universities of America. As we said earlier, the pirates helped to form these universities for the education of their own progeny. The lodge number for the Skull and Bones Society is 322, which also relates, of course, to the spring equinox, March 22nd, when the sun rises out of winter into the summer or the spring months. The Skull and Bones are referred to as the Brotherhood of Death. Lieutenant Colonel James Bo Greitz refers to them as the lesser of two evils, or the evil of two lessers. And Dr. James W. Wardner says, if the Skull and Bones is not itself the Illuminati, it is as close as you can get. Now, the German connection of the Skull and Bones is brought out by James W. Wardner in Unholy Alliances. He writes, in the 1790s, Jacques Millet Dupin established the Continental European Intelligence Service for Great Britain. The base for this operation was Bern, Switzerland. From 1807 to 1860, the leader of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry was John James Joseph Gurja Dupin de Ranger of Geneva, his cousin. Jacques Millet Dupin's grandson, Louis Millet, was also involved in British intelligence. Louis Millet's son, Bernard, was the private secretary to Britain's Lord Balfour and became president of the British Eugenics Organization. This takes us full circle back to George Bush's Skull and Bones. Bernard Millet was the honored guest at Bonesman Averell Harriman's race science celebration at the American Museum of Natural History in 1932, just prior to Hitler and the Nazis' takeover of Germany. So here we have Dr. Wardner is talking about the close association of the French Freemasons, the Nazi Party, and the elite industrialists and secret society members of America that then go on to create the Secretaries of Defense and the Secretaries of the Interior and whatnot, and even the presidency. A famous figure in public life in America, Pat Robertson of the Christian Coalition and 700 Club. Robertson attended Yale University's law school and the London School of Economics. It was the Fabian Society whose goal was world socialism which established the London School of Economics. In his book, The Secret Kingdom, Robertson says we are in the time of transition from the old discredited world order into the time of the emergence of the new. There is an invisible world of the spirit, he says. It is possible to draw help from that invisible world. There can be a new world order. It demands an inner revolution of attitude and outlook, he says. It turns ordinary ideas upside down. It sets the stage for a new world order. Now, in the Scottish Rite Freemasonic degrees, propagated, of course, by Albert Pike of the Illuminati, we have two interesting degrees that can be attained. One is the Knight of the Brazen Serpent, and the other is the Sublime Prince of the Royal Secret. Here, from any Masonic lodge, you can get a little chart of the degrees of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And those two degrees are on the right-hand side. The Sublime Prince of the Royal Secret is the top degree, the 32nd degree, and the Knight of the Brazen Serpent is the 25th degree. Now, the Knight of the Brazen Serpent, this brazen serpent, of course, goes back to Moses and to the Israelites. And we might ask about the 32nd degree. What is the Royal Secret? Of course, the Knight of the Brazen Serpent goes right back to Moses and the Israelites and all the way back to the time of Atlantis and the conflict between the serpent races. But the 32nd degree, Sublime Prince of the Royal Secret, what is this Royal Secret? Could this Royal Secret be the fact that the Freemasons are the keepers of the secrets of the bloodline? That people in public domain, elites within the religions of the world and the governments of the world are connected by blood, and that that bloodline secret is preserved by the Freemasons and Illuminati and secret societies of the world to which they all belong? Here we have on the American dollar bill not only the pyramid with the 13 levels and the New World Order with its 13 letters, but we have above the head of the eagle the Star of David with 13 stars. And of course the Star of David is an Israelite symbol. We have 33 feathers on the eagle on one side and 32 on the other, which talks about the 32nd and 33rd degrees of Freemasonry. And we have the 13 leaves and berries, the 13 stripes, and the 13 arrows. By the way, this symbol that's found on the dollar bill comes from two sources. It comes from the Rothschild dynasty of Frankfurt, and before that it comes from the tribe of Manasseh. That's of the 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of Manasseh. This is the exact logo, their exact emblem, a very ancient symbol. And of course, the politicians, the members of the Senate and the White House meet on Capitol Hill and go to Camp David. Where are these terms coming from? Here we see Hillary Clinton, the wife of President Bill Clinton, wearing the coveted and beloved phoenix, which of course was the symbol not only of the Freemasons but of the Tudor dynasty of England. So we may ask, who is the Rodham in Hillary Rodham Clinton? Here on the back of Australian coins is the head of the British monarch, but on the reverse side we find a dragon. For many people in today's world, it seems quite preposterous, or strange at least, to talk about genetics and genetic programs and genetic hybridization happening millennia ago, certainly happening 50,000 years ago. We associate today these sciences with the modern world. We think of silicon and everything that is technologically chic as being a very modern, making a modern appearance. But in fact, the genetic sciences are very ancient, as we've been demonstrating in this program. And today, again, the push is on to understand the nature of the genome, to understand the mysteries of the DNA. But for what? For what purpose? Is there something more malign behind the official claims that are being made? The need to cure all cancers? The same hand that creates the cancers is now out there spending more millions looking for the cure? Now, the first genetic experiments were done suggestively at Roslin Institute near Edinburgh. Anyone who's done their homework knows that Roslin Institute and Roslin itself was the headquarters of the Knights Templar, one of the most powerful secret fraternal orders in history, who were prominent in the discovery of America. Roslin in Gaelic actually means ancient knowledge handed down through the generations. It's simple etymology. And in the cathedrals and churches, you can go and visit the graveyards of the monks. You'll notice replete all over the architecture the skull and bones motif in Scotland, to which the Knights Templars made their way after they were suppressed in France. Now, the Masonic symbols, as you saw, is the compass and the rule, and this letter G, this mysterious letter G that keeps turning up. Now, of course, if you write G in the lower case, as it used to be done, you suddenly see why it is that the Masons are using the G, because that symbol is the cryptic symbol of the serpent. It's not G for God, it's not G for geometry, it's not G for Gaia or any of the other things that the would-be scholars of Masonry are thinking. It is simply a cryptic image for the serpent and the architects of the universe and the high sciences, the high scientists in control of man's body and the organization of the world. The compass and the rule. Don't believe it? They're basically telling you themselves. Here it is on the Gene Trust logo. The Gene Trust logo. Of all the symbols they could use, the serpentine G, and then they're telling you at the bottom as their little blurb, be a part of history. Yeah, be a part of their history. Again, on the front cover of so many magazines and so many periodicals, we keep on seeing this occultism crossing over with the science. Why are the scientists using the symbol of the serpent? Do they know something we don't know? These Medicis, these modern doctors, the medics. Interestingly, on the front cover of Time magazine for the countdown to war, very close to the outbreak of the Gulf War, the front cover has on the corner countdown to war in Iraq, in the homeland of civilization. But the front cover is not a war sign, or is it? It shows the primal scene, Adam and Eve and the DNA and the tree of life. We have to watch these juxtapositions, just as Dick Gregory has asked us to do, and many of the other scholars are asking you to do. Learn pattern recognition, learn symbol literacy, connect the dots to know what's going on. Now, the puppet masters would much prefer a race of soulless, programmable robots to serve them, and had that in mind. However, mechanical robots give as many problems as having problematic humans around, and the latter are still useful for various occult reasons. It was therefore thought best to reduce the organic human to the level of the machine, which has been, of course, overwhelmingly successful. Man, merely a largely imperfect evolutionary step towards the intelligent computer. This is what the brain drain of the think tanks and the MITs and the SRIs of the world are absolutely itching for, contemplating. They'll even tell you themselves that they can't wait for the days when man is an organic computer and he lives in a virtual hyperspace. They're back in business. Curtis R. Schaefer, engineer for Norton Key Corporation, says the ultimate achievement of biocontrol may be the control of man himself. The controlled subject would never be permitted to think as individuals. A few months after, a surgeon would equip each child with a socket mounted under the scalp and electrodes reaching selected areas of brain tissue. The child's sensory perceptions and muscular activity would be modified or completely controlled by bioelectric signals radiating from state-controlled transmitters. So there you have it, the general and the henchman. You've got the Huxleys, and you've got the Bertrand Russells, and you've got the Thomas Malthuses thinking it all up, and then you have their henchmen putting it into practice. Huxley says in Brave New World Revisited, it is perfectly possible for a man to be out of prison and yet not be free, to be under no physical constraint and yet be a psychological captive, compelled to think, feel, and act as the representatives of the national state, or of some private interest within the nation wants him to think, feel, and act. The nature of psychological compulsion is such that those who act under the constraint remain under the impression that they're acting on their own initiative. The victim of mind manipulation does not know that he is a victim. To him, the walls of his prison are invisible, and he believes himself to be free. That he is not free is apparent only to other people. His servitude is strictly objective. Dr. Jose Delgado of Yale University, and an expert in mind control, implants, and the author of Physical Control of the Mind Towards a Psycho-Civilized Civilization, writes, our understanding of genetics is very clumsy at present, but we can produce lethal mutations with EMF fields. Perhaps we will someday be able to use the technique to produce behavior changes. This new knowledge is so important that I think it should radically change the philosophy of our educational system, which believes in the sanctity of individuals, thinking that an individual exists at birth. This is not true, and this science is going to prove the fallacy of democracy in the sense that we talk about rights of the individual. This democratic belief is not true. Because we are forming this individual, because we are constructing his brain, we are willy-nilly making the differences we either desire or dislike. Werner Vinge, San Diego University professor of computer science, speaking in 1993, says, we are on the edge of a change comparable to the rise of human life on Earth. Within 30 years, we will have the technological means to create superhuman intelligence. Shortly after, the human era will end. Steve Quayle, who wrote the book Genetic Armageddon, says, a terrifying future thunders towards mankind, an impending fate embodied by monstrous, blasphemous combinations of human and animal genetic materials, of man, machine, of cyborgs, and of beings not only with increased capacities and extended lifespans, but also with re-engineered morality, void of compassion. This future is so abhorrent as to almost defy the imagination. These new beings and the transhumanists looking forward to their arrival will not be benevolent, just the opposite. Because the goal of those creating these beings will be that they will replace human beings, and the new race will be post-humans. The word post-human sounds innocuous enough until one realizes that post means after. On the humblest of advertisements, we get the message. Here of a Canon advertisement for the ELF camera. If we look up into the left-hand corner, we see the question, are you digital yet. Now the Knights of Malta cross, of the cross and the crown, and in this sign I will conquer. From this we can gather the means that is being used against, the principles that are being used against the human race. They have a particular methodology about how they go about securing their agenda and controlling the rest of us. One of the means of doing this I refer to as the infernal trinity of problem, confusion, solution. David Icke and other researchers in this exact field refer to it as problem, reaction, solution. But you see, reaction is too vague. It's not a reaction that they merely want, it is a confused reaction. So I prefer to have it as problem, confusion, solution. It's more commonly known as the Hegelian dialectic. Another manifesto of these secret societies is called the Occult Technocracy of Power. It's anonymously written. And in that book it says, the so-called left-right political spectrum is our creation. In fact, it accurately reflects our careful, artificial polarization of the population on phony issues that prevents the issue of our power from ever arising in their minds. And in my own book I say that, look, the opposition party is being called opposition by guess who? The opposition. Makes perfect sense. These are the masters of the game. As Fabian Sidney Webb had said, it's just an endless and exciting game of chess. And the masters of the dialectic, the Freemasons, that's what they have in every Freemasonic lodge should you go into one. The famous checkerboard, advertising to you exactly what they think of the human race and how they operate. It's a game. It's a three-party system. It's a triad. It's a pyramid. It's a triangle. Conservative, labor, liberal. Over here in America you have the Republicans and the Democrats and the so-called independents. Dr. Carroll Quigley, in his great work on the subject of secret societies, tragedy and hope, he writes, it must be recognized that the power that these energetic left-wingers exercised was never their own power or a communist power, but was ultimately the power of the international financial coterie. And Dr. Carroll Quigley is, of course, the guru of Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton has acclaimed Dr. Carroll Quigley many times and said that he was his main mentor. Dr. Quigley had all the archives of the secret societies open to him for the express purpose that he could write a book and tell us all about it. Not that we'd ever read it, but there it is in plain view from the horse's mouth. Now the problem, confusion, solution, we can see it operate. Deliberately create problems and then offer only those solutions which result in the expansion of government. Create conditions so frightful at home and abroad that the abandonment of personal liberties and national sovereignty will appear as a reasonable price to pay for a return to domestic tranquility and world peace. So says G. Edward Griffin, one of the great American researchers into alternative history and conspiratorial movements. Now, James Simon Coonan of the Strawberry Statement, in that book, he was one of the original college revolutionaries of the 60s, says, at the convention, men from Business International roundtables, the meeting sponsored by Business International for their client groups and heads of government, try to buy up a few radicals. They offered to finance our demonstrations in Chicago. We were also offered ESSO, that's Rockefeller money. They wanted us to make a lot of commotion. So here you have it from the horse's mouth. Here's one of the rebels that wouldn't give in, one of the leading activists in the movement of rebellion in the colleges on the East Coast, saying no sooner did we get created and try to overthrow the establishment than they're in the back door offering us all sorts of millions to do their bidding. And then we have Jerry Kirk, the famous black activist at the University of Chicago, was a radical member of SDS, the New Boys Club, the Black Panthers, and the Communist Party. But in 1969, he broke from the party and publicly declared the following. Young people have no conception, he said, of the conspiracy strategy of pressure from above and pressure from below. They have no idea that they are playing into the hands of the establishment they claim to hate. The radicals think they're fighting the forces of the super-rich, like Rockefeller and Ford, and don't realize that it is precisely such forces which are behind their own revolution, financing it and using it for their own purposes. Jerry Kirk goes on to say, the idea is to create a situation where the people are so frightened of all the chaos around them that they will throw up their arms in the air and shout, "Federal government, do something!" And the only choice will be martial law. The communists, black militants, and revolutionaries will never succeed in overthrowing the government of the United States, but unless they are stopped, they will scare the American people into accepting socialism from Washington, the status rule from the establishment. This is what it's really about. Now we actually find out that communism itself is part of the Illuminati conspiracy. One of the major offshoots of the Order of the Illuminati was called the League of the Just, and Karl Marx was a member. The League later changed its name to the Communist League. In 1847, they commissioned Marx to write their policy statement for the public. This became the Communist Manifesto. On the surface, it appears to be a call for the underclasses to rise up and overthrow their oppressors. However, the manifesto was financed by one of England's most prominent and wealthy business magnates, Frederick Engels. The name of Karl Marx did not even appear on the document until 20 years later. And Winston Churchill, before he got turned around to serve these forces, he wrote 3 years after the Bolshevik Revolution the following: from the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx, Bella Kuhn, Rosa Luxemburg, and Emma Goldman, this worldwide conspiracy has been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century. And now at last it grips the Russian people by the hair of their heads. Now we saw that the Knights Templars and the Knights of Malta have the symbol of the crown and the cross representing a methodology. We talked about the dialectic. And in Zurich, over the world headquarters of Freemasonry, is written in Latin above the door, Ordo ab chaos, which translates into English as order out of chaos, just as Jerry Kirk is saying. They create order, and then there's chaos, just as G. Edward Griffin is saying. They create order, and then they create the chaos. And we throw up our hands with all the calamity in the world around us, and all the insecurity and the fear and the terrorism and whatnot, and say, please come in and help us, federal government. But nobody could put it quite as well as Albert Pike himself. In his letter to Giuseppe Manzini, Albert Pike, the head of the Illuminati and Scottish Rite Freemasonry in America, he puts it this way: we shall unleash the nihilists and the atheists, and we shall provoke a formidable social cataclysm which, in all its horror, will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism, origin of savagery, and the most bloody turmoil. Then, everywhere, the citizens, obliged to defend themselves against the world minority of revolutionaries, will exterminate those destroyers of civilization, and the multitude, then disillusioned with Christianity, anxious for an ideal, will receive the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer. Benjamin Disraeli, the first Jewish Prime Minister of England, who spent his whole life trying to expose these secret society networks, he says, the government of this country has not only to deal with governments, kings and ministers, but also with secret societies, elements which must be taken into account, which at the last minute can bring our plans to nothing, which have agents everywhere, who incite assassinations and can, if necessary, lead a massacre. In the World Constitution of the United Nations, it says, the age of nations must end. The governments of the nations have decided to order their separate sovereignties into one government to which they will surrender their arms. In Harper's Magazine, July 1958, we read, the CFR, that's the Council on Foreign Relations, was founded for the purpose of promoting disarmament and submergence of U.S. sovereignty and national independence into an all-powerful one world government. And one world government henchman, John Foster Dulles, writes, the United Nation represents not a final stage in the development of world order, but a primitive stage. Therefore, its primary task is to create the conditions which will make possible a more highly developed organization. Strobe Talbot, in 1992, he's the Deputy Secretary of State, said, "Within the next 100 years, nationhood as we know it will be obsolete. All states will recognize a single global authority. All countries are basically social arrangements, no matter how permanent and even sacred they may seem at any one time. In fact, they are artificial and temporary." Arthur Schlesinger Jr. says, "We are not going to achieve a new world order without paying for it in blood as well as in words and money." And Lord Cecil, one of the prime movers of the Round Table Organization of England, says that national governments must go in the interest of world government, world police, and world currency. And David Rockefeller says, "All we need is the right major crisis, and the nations will accept the New World Order." And prime mover James Warburg, in February 17th, 1950, said, "We shall have world government, whether or not you like it, by conquest or consent." Edward Bernays, in his book Propaganda, he says the conscious and intelligent manipulation of organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government which is the true ruling power in our country. A relatively small number of persons. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind and who harness the wild social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world. Now, Congressman Larry P. McDonald, who was killed in the Korean Airlines 747 disaster that was shot down by the Soviets in 1976, Congressman McDonald says, "The drive of the Rockefellers and their allies is to create a one-world government combining super-capitalism and communism under the same tent, all under their control. Do I mean conspiracy? Yes, I do. I am convinced there is such a plot, international in scope, generations old in planning, and incredibly evil in intent." James Madison, one of the founding fathers, presidents, said, "The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." But Kissinger has the opposite idea. He says, the illegal we do immediately, the unconstitutional, that takes a little longer. He also says elsewhere, "Today, America would be outraged if United Nations troops entered Los Angeles to restore order. Tomorrow, they would be grateful. This is especially true if they were told that there was an outside threat from beyond that threatened our very existence. It is then that all people of the world will plead to deliver them from this evil. When presented with this scenario, individual rights will be willingly relinquished for the guarantee of their well-being granted to them by the world government." Now, if one looks at the symbol for the United Nations, and symbols are very important to study as we've been seeing, but if you look at that actual symbol of United Nations, it's like a grid overlooking the globe of the earth and then surrounded by the laurel leaves, the old Roman emperor symbols, coming out of the ancient world, the ancient fascist symbols. But the grid is interesting too, because if you count the segments of the grid, including the circle in the middle, it makes the number 33. So who is it that encompasses the world? Who has put their matrix, their template over the globe of all the nations and the ship of state? The 33, the 33rd degree of the Freemasons. It's all in the symbolism. Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his book Between Two Ages, says, "The technotronic era involves the gradual appearance of a more controlled society. Such a society would be dominated by an elite, unrestrained by traditional values." In Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, he also says something a lot more pertinent than that. He says, "Moreover, as America becomes an increasingly multicultural society, it may find it more difficult to fashion a consensus on foreign policy issues, except in the circumstance of a truly massive and widely perceived direct and external threat." Hermann Göring the Reich minister for the Nazi Party in Germany in the 30s and 40s, said, "The people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them that they're being attacked and denounce the peacemakers for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country." Now, General Douglas MacArthur in 1957, he tells us, "Our government has kept us in a perpetual state of fear, kept us in a continuous stampede of patriotic fervor, with the cry of grave national emergency. Always there has been some terrible evil at home, or some monstrous foreign power that was going to gobble us up if we did not blindly rally behind it." And Julius Caesar tells us, "Beware the leader who bangs the drums of war in order to whip the citizenry into a patriotic fervor, for patriotism is indeed a double-edged sword. It both emboldens the blood just as it narrows the mind. And when the drums of war have reached a fever pitch and the blood boils with hate and the mind is closed, the leader will have no need in seizing the rights of the citizenry. Rather, the citizenry, infused with fear and blinded by patriotism, will offer up all their rights unto the leader, and gladly so. How do I know? For this is what I have done, and I am Caesar." And who said, what author was it who said that patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel? Was it Victor Hugo? President George Herbert Walker Bush puts it this way: "Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective," there's that number 5 again, the pentagram, "our fifth objective, a new world order can emerge, a new era, freer from the threat of terror, stronger in the pursuit of justice and more secure. Today, a new world is struggling to be born, a world quite different from the one we've known, a world where the rule of law supplants the rule of the jungle." Now, curiously, this speech was given on September 11th, 1990, at 9:09 p.m. That's 11 years to the day before the attack on New York. It was given before the joint session of Congress on the Persian Gulf crisis. The speech begins at 9:09 p.m. At approximately 9:11 p.m., he was speaking the lines, "The New World Order." So we have chaos at home. We have chaos abroad. We have burning buildings and police state. Why? All the chaos and the confusion. And people are throwing up their hands saying, "Save us, save us. What do we do against the terror?" Not the terrorism, but the terror. And there's a difference. And the answer is, get rid of your constitution. Give us your rights and all will be well. Hand over your sovereignty. Hand over your thinking. Hand over your children. We have the Office of Information Awareness. The only trouble is, through their symbolism, they're telling you they're nothing more than a wing of the Illuminati. For there it is, the pyramid in the eye, overlooking the whole of the world. We see everything. Big Brother is watching you. Ron Paul, the congressman from Texas, talking about the Patriot Act, says, "It is a clear violation of all the civil liberties of Americans." And Honorable Cynthia McKinney, the Democratic congressperson from Georgia, says, "It appears to me that the American people might have a criminal syndicate running their government." On the question of patriotism, we're reminded by Theodore Roosevelt, patriotism means to stand by the country. It does not mean to stand by the president. But here it is, New World Order, new and improved. Karl Marx and Albert Pike wrote it. George Bush and his coterie are implementing it. Jonathan Quitney, in Crimes of Patriots, writes, "Neither the director of the CIA nor the deputy director had in his career shown any reluctance to shed American or foreign blood in covert military operations." And of course, we have the famous Orwellian doublespeak, every day on the news, every day coming down from the corridors of power, confusion in the words, terror and terrorism and all sorts of other doublespeak. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. In USA Today, Bill Clinton had said, "We can't be so fixated on our desire to preserve the rights of ordinary Americans." And on MTV, on April 19th, he said, "A lot of people say there's too much personal freedom. When personal freedom is being abused, you have to move to limit it." And in 1992, he said, "Mine will be the most ethical administration in the history of the Republic." Yes, but the only problem is, what about the 52 people who died violent deaths all around him? When's the last time 52 people you know dropped dead around you of violent crimes? Now, it is a fact that the people in the media, those even leaders that seem to be quite illustrious, happen to be only the front men for the hidden hands that work and operate behind them, who are a great deal more shadowy. We might refer to them as the true underworld figures. The people's champions, of course, are always put out in front of us. They're the ones we see. They're the ones we love to hate. But who is it that is at the top of the pyramid? As you can see, the top of the pyramid is removed from the rest of the edifice. So who are the people at the very top, the controlling hands? Benjamin Disraeli, the Prime Minister of England, said, "The world is run by very different personages from what is imagined by those who are not behind the scenes." And Felix Frankfurter, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice in 1952, said, "The real rulers in Washington are invisible and exercise power from behind the scenes." Senator Daniel K. Inouye says, "There exists a shadowy government with its own air force, its own navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself." Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky of the Theosophical Society writes, "But there exists another class of adepts belonging to a brotherhood also, and mightier than any other. They have to be ranked with the adepts of the black art. These are our Roman Catholic fathers and clergy, 100 times more learned in secret symbology and the old religion than our Orientalists will ever be. There are more profoundly learned Kabbalists in Rome and throughout Europe and America than is generally suspected. Thus are the brotherhoods of black adepts more powerful and dangerous than any host of Eastern occultists." Gore Vidal, in his latest book, Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, says, in reference to the FBI Director Louis Freeh, "Former Senator Danforth threatened the recalcitrant FBI Director Louis Freeh with a search warrant. It is a pity that he did not get one. He might in the process have discovered a bit more about Freeh's membership in Opus Dei, meaning God's work, a secretive international Roman Catholic order dedicated to getting its membership into high political, corporate, and religious offices in various lands to various ends. Media light was cast on the order when it was discovered that Robert Hansen, an FBI agent, had been a Russian spy for 22 years, but also that he and his director, Louis Freeh, were not only were both members of the same Roman Catholic Church in suburban Virginia, but also belonged to the local chapter of Opus Dei." And anyone who's taken the time to watch Francis Ford Coppola's Godfather 3 will know what Vidal is talking about here, about the connections between the Vatican and the mafioso, La Cosa Nostra, and many other secret societies. Blavatsky also says, "While the real brothers died ignominious deaths, the spurious order, which tried to step into their shoes, became exclusively a branch of the Jesuits," that's the Illuminati, "under the immediate tutelage of the latter. True-hearted Masons ought to reject with horror any connection, let alone descent from these." And she makes a valid point there, because when we are looking at the Freemasons, we're not talking about the average Freemason that joins the lodge in a well-meaning humanitarian consciousness right off the street. Those are called the speculative Masons, the blue and the red degrees. We're talking about bloodline Masons. I have to make this very clear. We're talking about bloodline Masons coming from bloodline families, those who have not been initiated from the street level and who operate on a completely different basis. In her Secret Doctrine, Volume 3, Madame Blavatsky writes, "There are numbers of these mystic brotherhoods which have nothing to do with civilized countries, and it is in their unknown communities that are concealed the skeletons of the past. These adepts could, if they chose, lay claim to strange ancestry. A British intelligence operation swept Madame Blavatsky aside, says James Wardner in his book Unholy Alliances. And she was replaced by British Fabian Society co-founder Annie Besant. Foster Bailey, a 33rd degree Mason, was a leader of the Theosophic Society. His wife Alice A. Bailey founded the Lucifer Trust. Alice Bailey was in the broad circles of society around Queen Victoria, and she always sought wealthy and titled converts. Lucifer Trust. Well, Lucifer Trust later morphs and becomes the Lucius Trust, which just happens to be the publishing company for all the documents of the United Nations. So the United Nations has an occult publisher producing all of its paperwork, the Lucius Trust, which was once Annie Besant's Lucifer Trust. A.E. Waite, from the Order of the Golden Dawn, a great scholar, says, beneath the broad tide of human history there flow the stealthy undercurrents of the secret societies, which frequently determine in the depths the changes that take place upon the surface. And Giuseppe Mazzini himself, none other than the head of the Illuminati, says, we form an association of brothers in all points of the globe, yet there is one unseen that can hardly be felt, yet it weighs on us. Whence comes it? Where is it? No one knows, or at least no one tells. This association is secret even to us, the veterans of the secret societies. What? I mean, hierarchy is one thing, and now we have so-called the top man, the people at the top of the pyramid saying, no, guess what, folks? There's even a higher degree. We're not talking 32nd, 33rd degree. We're not talking Knights Templar degrees. We're not talking Illuminati. Something is even behind that, and we don't know what it is. Albert Pike. In addition to the letter he wrote to Mazzini in 1871, another he wrote to the heads of the Palladian councils on July 14th, 1889, fell into the hands other than intended. It was written to explain the Luciferian dogma concerning worship of Satan and worship of Lucifer. In it he said, in part, that which we say to the crowd is, we worship God. The religion should be, by all us initiates of the higher degrees, maintained in the purity of the Lucifer doctrine. Yes, Lucifer is God. Now the Duke of Brunswick, who is the world head of Freemasonry in the 1700s, the Grand Master of World Freemasonry, became aware that his organization had been infiltrated by the Illuminati from Bavaria. So he stood up and he asked for the worldwide disbandment of World Freemasonry. He writes, I have been convinced that we, as an order, have come under the power of some very evil occult order, profoundly versed in science, both occult and otherwise. Though not infallible, their methods, being black magic, that is to say, electromagnetic power, hypnotism, and powerful suggestion. We are convinced that the order is being controlled by some sun order, after the nature of the Illuminati, if not by that order itself. Now, unfortunately, the Illuminati succeeded in uniting with Freemasonry at the Council of Wilhelmsbad in 1780. Now, John Robinson, in his book of 1798, this is one of the earliest books that was written on the Illuminati, dating from 1798, just in case anyone thinks that conspiracy theories are a new thing of the 20th century, think again. John Robinson was approached, he was a dean or a senior in a Scottish university. He was approached by members of the Illuminati and he was recruited. But after discovering what they were really about, he left and wrote Proofs of a Conspiracy. And this book circulated amongst members of the Civil War in America. John Robinson says in Proofs of a Conspiracy, the great strength of our order lies in its concealment. Let it never appear in any place in its own name, but always covered by another name and another occupation. None is fitter than the 3 lower degrees of Freemasonry. The public is accustomed to it, expects little from it, and therefore takes little notice of it. General J.F.C. Fuller, who's a war historian, in 1941 wrote, the government of the Western nations, whether monarchical or republican, has passed into the invisible hands of a plutocracy, international in power and grasp. It was, I venture to suggest, this semi-occult power which pushed the mass of the American people into the cauldron of World War I. Woodrow Wilson, in his book The New Freedom, 1913, said, "Some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacture are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it." Speaking of the Jacobins, which the Jacobins is just another term in Scotland or in Europe for the Illuminati. Gore Vidal, speaking on the Jacobins, said, "It is nicely apt that the word terrorist, according to the old Oxford English Dictionary, should have been coined during the French Revolution to describe an adherent or supporter of the Jacobins who advocated and practiced methods of partisan repression and bloodshed in the propagation of the principles of democracy and equality. Although our rulers have revived the word to describe violent enemies of the United States, most of today's actual terrorists can be found within our own governments, federal, state, and municipal. The Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco and Firearms, known as the ATF, the Drug Enforcement Agency, FBI and IRS, etc., are so many Jacobins at war against the lives, freedoms, and property of our citizens. The FBI slaughter of the innocents at Waco was a model Jacobin enterprise." Now, Joseph Willard, the president of Harvard University, no less, writes this, or speaks this, following a quote during his retirement. He says, "There is sufficient evidence that a number of societies of the Illuminati have been established in this land. They are doubtless striving to secretly undermine all our ancient institutions, civil and sacred. We live in an alarming period. The enemies of all order are seeking our ruin. Should infidelity generally prevail, our independence would fall, of course. Our Republican government would be annihilated." And here again we have another leading figure, a light of the intellectual community, waiting to his retirement, because, as Woodrow Wilson already said, those who even know about the conspiracy often don't raise a murmur against it, and if they do, they make sure that their bases are covered first. But let's not believe that individuals of this rank in our society are not fully aware of who is pulling the strings and running the show. There have been many books on this very subject. You can visit my website, you can go to the links page and use that, just that one links page as a resource if you're coming to this subject for the first time. But let it be known that there are many books and many researchers out there for many generations who have brought these facts before mankind. We've had G. Edward Griffin, as we saw, but we also have Fritz Springmeier, who wrote The Bloodline of the Illuminati. It's a very excellent book on the subject. We have the Proofs of the Illuminati, and we have the works of John Coleman, who was in fact an MI6 agent in Britain before he left and tried to explain and expose the whole conspiracy. His book, Committee of 300, and One World Order, and Diplomacy by Deception, are excellent books. We have books on Masonry, we have books on the Illuminati. This is a subject that can be researched. And one of the most senior intellectual figures of American history was Professor Carroll Quigley. Now, Carroll Quigley was Bill Clinton's guru. He was the guru not just of Bill Clinton, but of many other politicians. This is the book that he wrote, this voluminous expose. In fact, being an insider, he was given, all the records were exposed before him of the entire network, the technocracy, the aristocracy, the oligarchy. And he wrote this thick book, basically explaining all of their agendas. But then again, how many people are going to read a book this thick? Recently, it's even been noticed that even a best-selling book like Michael Moore's bestseller, Stupid White Men, or any book comparable to that, reaches 1 million people in America, whereas the average hit TV primetime show reaches 20 million at least. So there's your predicament right there. And since most people don't even read books, they read the newspapers or they flick through magazines, they just listen to the sound bites that's coming over Bill O'Reilly or CNN, no wonder that the great depth of this subject has not hitherto been brought out. But let it be known that from both sides of the field, pro and negative, there have been volumes and books written on this subject. Now, from Carroll Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope, he writes, there does exist, and has existed for a generation, an international Anglophile network, which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the communists act. In fact, this network, which we may identify as the round table groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or any other groups, and frequently does so. I know of the operations of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records. I have no aversion to it or to most of its aims, and have, for much of my life, been close to it and to many of its instruments. One of the most senior and also most sinister figures of the conspiracy, again, a puppet master controlling those overworld figures that are put before us, was an individual by the name of Colonel Mandel House. Now, I cover him more extensively and other creatures like him in the other program in this series, Evil's Willing Servants. Colonel Mandel House was the author of a book called Philip Drew, Administrator. Colonel Mandel House, says G. Edward Griffin, was the man who selected Woodrow Wilson as a presidential candidate and later became his principal advisor. Wilson was totally dependent on House for all political decisions. In fact, in the words of Woodrow Wilson, he says, Mr. House is my second personality. He is my independent self. His thoughts and mine are one. If I were he, I would do just as he suggested. Now, I want you to please note the kind of language there. People who are interested in the subject of mind control could make something of that statement. The strange tonality, the strange insidious nature of that, the fact of an alter ego. I mean, this is a whole subject in itself about how the control operates. My second personality. He is my independent self. The book by Mandel House, Philip Drew, Administrator, which basically reveals his entire agenda, was disguised as a novel to dupe the masses. It was a blueprint for the radical socialist revolution and the enslavement of the United States during the Wilson and Roosevelt presidencies. So just in case you think that Woodrow Wilson and President Roosevelt were the mainspring, the main voices, the main leaders, the main architects of their policies, this book and many others will show you what was really going on, all the way down to the Bretton Woods Agreement, into the League of Nations and the United Nations, and all the policies that we now find coming out of that era. Abraham Lincoln, in his letter to Colonel William Elkins on November 21st, 1864, makes this remarkable statement. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow. And the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people, until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. I feel at this moment more anxiety for the safety of my country than ever before, even in the midst of war. John F. Kennedy wrote on April 27th, 1961, or he openly spoke these words. He said, the very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. And then later he said, the high office of president has been used to foment a plot to destroy the Americans' freedom, and before I leave office, I must inform the citizen of his plight. So in all of the different movies and books that have been written, how come we haven't heard this publicly? Now, we'll remember that he did leave office, but not in the way that he thought he would. This statement was written 10 days prior to his assassination. His assassination was for many reasons, partly connected to the gold standard and partly connected to the fact that he was perhaps a Catholic, and there was Catholic dynasties rivaling what we would call the Protestant dynasties. So there's lots of infighting. But here we have a verbatim statement saying that he was going to expose certain levels of the conspiracy, certain levels. This is the president himself. And 10 days later, he does leave office. In fact, Jim Marrs, an expert on the Kennedy assassination, in his book Crossfire, The Plot That Killed Kennedy, says, in the 3-year period which followed the murders of President Kennedy and Lee Harvey Oswald, 18 material witnesses died, 6 by gunfire, 3 in motor accidents, 1 by suicide, 1 from a cut throat, 1 from a karate chop to the neck, and 5 from natural causes. And Craig Robertson, John Armstrong, and JFK, The Dead Witnesses, write, a mathematician hired by the London Sunday Times concluded that the odds of the number of witnesses involved in the assassination dying between November 22nd, 1963 and that date were 100,000 trillion to 1 in the time period ranging from November 22nd, 63 to August 1993. Over 115 witnesses, quote-unquote, have died or fallen victim to death by strange circumstances, suicides or murder. I think that's a phenomenon merely of the 60s. His Majesty Bill Clinton, over 52 people died in exactly the same way. Violent deaths, unexplained deaths. And when's the last time you knew of 52, 40 people, 20, 30? How many people around you have just dropped dead from violent deaths? And yet again, this conspiracy is pushed under the carpet as if nothing ever happened. People go blithely along the same old way. G. Edward Griffin, one of the leading American researchers into the field of subversive movements, puts it beautifully this way. Conspiracy, he says, one of the darkest words in the language of man. Yet there is hardly a single page of history that does not partially reveal the deadly eye of conspiracy at work. It was a conspiracy that led Brutus against Caesar in the Roman Senate on the Ides of March, that plotted the betrayal of West Point by Benedict Arnold during the American Revolution, that led John Wilkes Booth to assassination of President Kennedy, President Lincoln, on Good Friday, 1865. The past record of man is burdened with accounts of assassinations, secret combines, palace plots, and betrayals in war. But in despite of this clear record, an amazing number of people have begun to scoff at the possibility of conspiracy at work today. They dismiss such an idea merely as a conspiratorial view. James Billington, another leading light in the subject of revolutionary movements and subversive activities, wrote this book, Fire in the Minds of Men. This individual is no less than the leading scholar involved in the Library of Congress, a fantastic historian who specialized in subversive movements. He writes in his book, The Fire in the Minds of Men, The Origins of the Revolutionary Faith. He writes, the plain fact is that by the mid-1810s, there were not just 1 or 2, but scores of secret societies and revolutionary organizations throughout Europe, extending even into Latin America and the Middle East. And it was they who, in the process of modernization, pioneered a phenomena by now familiar: impatient youth forming their own organizations to combat the monarchical religious authority. The story of secret societies can never be fully reconstructed, but it has been badly neglected, even avoided, one suspects, because the evidence that is available repeatedly leads one into the territory equally uncongenial to modern historians in the East and in the West. Now, J. Edgar Hoover, crazy as he was, said one thing that is interesting. He said, the individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous that he cannot believe it exists. And this is very accurate, because here we are, stressed out, overworked, underpaid. We've got so much going on in our domestic lives that we really don't have the time for anything more than sound bites. Now, I don't know, though, whether some of you are still misinformed enough or even naive enough to not realize that there is something very seriously wrong in the world today politically, not just in America and the West, but throughout the entire world. And we better know that, because we have to know what the problems are before we can even hope to arrive at the solutions. When one looks, as we've been doing, at the statements of those who do know that there is something going on, we also find their statements that there is a conspiracy, coupled with the fact that it is our own gullibility, our own complicity that is maintaining this status quo. Now, as a teacher, I'm constantly coming across people who aggressively and even indignantly get up in the face and say, there's no such thing as a conspiracy, a worldwide conspiracy with secret societies moving. This new flatline mentality can best be summed up as, if I don't see it happening in my life, then it doesn't exist. So if it's invisible to you, then obviously it doesn't exist. Now, if we go to the third world, in comparison to this, if we go to those who live in Africa, if we go to those who live in, East Timor or Cambodia, if we go to those who live near the Amazon, who when they pull their shutters, aside every morning, they see their beautiful land, their jungle being torn to shreds by Western corporations, they are not in any doubt that there's a big brother operating in the world. This denial is a luxury that we have in Middle America or in the world. It's a luxury we can still at this time afford. But what really gets me is that even on a more domestic and lower level, there are still conspiracies, quote unquote, happening before our eyes. Ones that can be handled very easily and yet are not handled. For instance, there is legal and constitutional protection against the corporate involvement and the corporate takeover of government. These edicts and these legislations have long been in power, and yet what gets done? Almost next to nothing. The corporate, even in this present administration, the corporate involvement in politics is obvious. The whole swing door attitude is very much obvious to us if we look. We have high-level members of government who have corporate connections, becoming part of the government, taking senior ranks so that they can further the agenda of their corporate buddies and their corporations, and then quickly exiting when they've done their job and moving straight back into the corporate world. Here we have in the 2004 George Bush election, we have half the cabinet resigning after he gets into power. Now wait a minute, what happens? What is all this about? The election takes place, nobody speaks a word of any resignations, they get Bush back into power, and then half the cabinet suddenly resign. Where have we ever heard of such a thing? Why are they resigning, and what for? It is understood when we realize how the corporate entity works. And that's just a low-level, normal, in-your-face conspiracy that there's plenty of legislation in the world, more than enough legislation to deal with, and yet nobody deals with it. It carries on as if nothing ever happened. Now we have drugs and drug peddling on every street of the world and of the West. We have record rates of crime. We have white-collar crime soaring through the ceiling. We have suspicious mortality taking place in the hospitals all across the land. We have suspicious activities from doctors. We have massive pharmaceutical monopolization of the planet. We have vote fraud that the mafia would envy. And yet with all of these local, community, neighborhood crimes, and with all of the well-meaning individuals, almost next to nothing gets done. And yet there's laws on the books to handle this kind of thing. So why is it then, even with the police force, the FBI having a criminal conspiracy division, which implies that there is such a thing as a criminal conspiracy operating in the world, the average individual adamantly stands up and denies that there's a worldwide conspiracy? I mean, there's enough corruption in your own communities. These same individuals who can't handle that, can never get a handle on any of this, are happy to stand up and in a couple of sound bites tell you that there's no worldwide global conspiracy, no oligarchy, no pyramid, no hierarchical system bent on the control of mankind. This is the ignorance factor that one has to put up with the new, as I said, flatliner mentality. Now, in fact, the burden of proof is really not on those who believe that there is a conspiracy operating in the world. The burden of proof is really on those who would stand up and oppose that fact. That is why I think it is that those who have studied this subject thoroughly, who really know their facts, have never actually been taken on head to head, whether that be Jordan Maxwell or Eustace Mullins or Alex Jones, or Anthony J. Hilder, or even lower level scholars in this subject like Amy Goodman, for instance, or Greg Palast. It's not a habit that they're taken on face to face for that very reason. The opposition knows that as soon as it would engage anyone who has the knowledge, the cat would be very much out of the bag, because we have, as I've been demonstrating here, we have the proof, we have the facts. And it's not really possible, is it, on the media as we know it today to be able to even get into this whole question in a couple of sound bites. In fact, you couldn't even get into the pros and cons of this in a very lengthy conversation. So that also helps to debar the whole expose. What I urge you to do is to get your hands around the facts. I can only give that part that I have discovered, because in fact no one person has all the answers with this. It's a very complex and ancient subject. It goes back far in time, and it takes a while. One has to be patient and diligent, and like any good detective, a great deal of patience and constancy is needed. So I provide my audiences with the information that I have gleaned, and you provide what you have discovered, but you have to get your arms and your mind around as many of the facts as you possibly can. And you also need a great deal of bravery, because it takes bravery to be able to go against the flow. But in short, if researchers such as myself are advocating this, it's not because we have nothing better to do. If we're into the subject of conspiracy, it's not because we've got nothing better to do. And we are empowered, and we've researched the whole subject through and through. And I myself have plowed through all of the misinformation, all the wacko-jacko theories that are out there. And I know from my time living in Ireland exactly how the game of politics works, how the game of the dialectic, both sides being pitted against each other, the whole problem, reaction, solution situation works. I saw it at first hand and know how that is very successful to those in power, and why it is that they choose to use the pyramid and the triangle as a symbol. Let us not tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories was one of the first statements George Bush made after the declaration of war in the Middle East, to which John Judge, who is a leading researcher of alternative history and conspiracy, says, well, I don't mind being called a conspiracy theorist by those who don't mind being called coincidence theorists. But many individuals will rightly say, those who are interested and those who are well-meaning and those who want to know the facts, okay, so you say there's a force behind the open governments of the world. You say that there are shady individuals or secret societies and subversive movements operating behind the veil of national security, behind the political edifices, on a higher level. Give us some proof, give us some evidence. Well, in an American context and even in a British context, one of the organizations that's very important to look out for is called the Trilateral Commission, and they are connected to the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, the Council on Foreign Relations, this is the American wing of the British Round Table organization, originally formed by billionaire Cecil Rhodes and controlled by Lord Alfred Milner, the Governor General and High Commissioner of South Africa. In fact, by the way, Cecil Rhodes is how we get the name Rhodesia. But Alfred Milner, his henchman, was the controller of several banks, including the Midland Bank in England. The Round Table Group, says G. Edward Griffin, in the United States, promptly created an external organization known as the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. It is through this organizational ring and then outward, through tax-exempt foundations, universities, and government agencies, that the international capitalist conspiracy has dominated the domestic and foreign policy of the United States for over 50 years. The Communist Party began in 1929. In the investigation of communist propaganda, we learned that the Communist Party in the United States was first organized in Chicago in September 1919, shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. This was the same year as the formation of the Council on Foreign Relations, who presently have complete control over all aspects of the United States government. The Royal Institute of International Affairs was the predecessor to the conspiratorial group which makes up America's controlling oligarchy today, the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR. Lord Robert Cecil was the chairman of the Supreme Economic Council at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, where the CFR was founded. Now, it might come as a shock to some people to realize that Trotsky and Lenin lived and worked in the Bronx in New York, and that Karl Marx wrote his manifestos not only in London but in Paris. These individuals were international terrorists and were funded by the bankers and the oligarchy from New York. This has all been brought out and proven. G. Edward Griffin goes on to say, the semi-secret CFR has over 1,400 elite personalities. In Harper's Magazine of July 1958, CFR member Joseph Kraft disclosed that one of the chief architects of the organization was Colonel Mandel House. Kraft boasted that the members included the President, the Secretary of State, the Chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, the Director of the CIA, the Board Chairman of the 3 of the country's 5 industrial corporations, 2 of the 4 richest insurance companies, and 2 of the 3 biggest banks, plus the senior partners of the 3 leading Wall Street law firms, the publisher of the 2 biggest news magazines, and of the country's most influential newspaper, and the presidents of the big 3 in both universities and foundations, as well as a score of other college presidents and scattering of top scientists and journalists. The CFR from behind the scenes has dominated this nation for decades. CFR members include top executives and journalists for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Daily News, Harper's, Look, Time, Life, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, CBS, NBC, MGM. They include directors of the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Endowment Fund. They include Presidents Hoover, Eisenhower, Johnson, and Nixon, Secretaries of State Stettenau, Acheson, Dulles, Carter, and Rusk, a fantastic percentage of the President's cabinet, undersecretaries, and Federal Reserve Board, ambassadors to other countries, Supreme Court justices, and presidential advisors. The average American has never heard of the CFR, yet it is the unseen government of the United States. And let's not forget, the CFR is a wing of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which is connected to the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, and is connected to the Round Table organization created by Cecil Rhodes, who was a billionaire industrialist, and whose connections to Masonry are all been studied and researched and thoroughly documented. And again, in their own words. You don't have to go to any detractor. You merely go to their own documents, their own words. For those who are very interested in the ancient connection, we digressed slightly and brought things up to the modern era, but perhaps it's also important to re-stress exactly how these oligarchs follow through in a bloodline manner. And one of the most important connections from the ancient world, the ancient dynasties, up into the modern, are a group of people from Italy, from Venice specifically, that have dominated the world for many generations, that have been loosely called the Black Venetians. Now this term, the Black Venetians or the Black Nobility, is their own term. This is not just a historical term used for them. This is one of their own terms. And they became known as the Black Nobility or the Black Venetians because literally their deeds were so black. Now, the word Phoenician, who were the ancient descendants of the Atlantean race, an old ancient Semitic race. The Phoenicians were like the elites of the Semites. Okay, we have the Semitic race. The Semitic race is the largest racial group in the world. Well, we have many branches of the Semitic peoples. And the elites, you could say the royalty within the Semitic race, were what we know as the Phoenician race. These are the people who built the Temple of Solomon, who were the great navigators, the great mappers of the sky, and the great mathematicians and so on. Well, down into the modern world, as we progress through the ages, the word Phoenician, as the Phoenicians settled in Italy, they became known as the Venetians. And they're worshippers of Venus. One of their gods or goddesses was literally Venetian. They're Venus worshippers. And that figures because if you're on the high seas, the stars and the moon and the luminaries are very important to you. And the Venetians, we have many families making up the Venetian oligarchy, but the Longhi and the Guelphs are of particular interest. Now, upon their move to Holland, the Black Venetians created the Great Amsterdam Bank, the financial hinge of the 17th century, and they also created the Dutch East India Company. They also controlled the finances of many royal dynasties, like the Stuarts. So they were lenders, financiers of some of the royal families. They are also the promoters of Martin Luther, of Protestantism, Puritanism, the Jesuits, the Club of Rome, the later Freemasons, and most other secret societies. Through the House of Hanover, that's the House of Orange, they came to England and have been the dominating power since William III. Christina Huth, in her book Venice, The Methodology of Evil, Part 3, she writes, Henry VIII had also thrown open the door for the cultural, political, and financial takeover of England by agents of the city-state of Venice. By the middle of the 1530s, Henry's government was in the hands of the Venetian agents and being shaped into a model of police-state political terror. By the end of Henry's reign, Venetian bankers were in control of a burgeoning English foreign debt and dictating terms to the English throne. Within slightly over a century following Henry's death, England had been transformed into the usurious, slave-trading imperial power of Great Britain under the dictatorship of the Venetian party, which had been transplanted directly from the lagoons of Venice. Now, obviously, in one program, we can't go into this subsection, the whole story of the Venetian peoples. Just for now, doing an overview to show you that here we have the connection between the Stuarts, the Tudors, and these Venetians. And the takeover was implemented by Thomas Cromwell. This was the agent who convinced Henry VIII to buy in and to accept the money of the incoming Venetians. So this connection is very, very vital and important to understand how the Phoenician, Sumerian, Babylonian, Mesopotamian, Nephilim concept, that bloodline, ties into the modern oligarchs. There's a thread. It can be traced like anything. The congressman and statesman Lyndon LaRouche, from an American context, is one of the greatest experts on this. But there's many other works talking about this connection. King William III of Hanover, the Prince of Orange. And we have George Ludwig I, also of the House of Hanover. These are the two kings, specifically, of the House of Orange, coming out of Italy by way of Holland. They appear in the history books as being Dutch kings, Dutch potentates, but their ancestry goes further back than that. Graham Lowry, in How the Venetian Virus Infected and Took Over England, writes, in December 1688, the armies of the Dutch Prince William of Orange invaded England, interrupting the Hobbesian nightmare the country had experienced under the deranged King Charles II and his brother James II. A worse nightmare was to follow when William seized the throne of James II, for he embodied a more highly distilled form of poison, which Venice had perfected during its sway over the remains of the Dutch Republic. This outright usurpation is blithely referred to in British Venetian parlance as the Glorious Revolution, which should give you some idea of how little regard for truth prevails in these circles. So here's a scholar who's in no doubt about the problem whatsoever. He's pointing out that the James II and Charles II debauchery is one thing, and then it's replaced by yet even more layers of the same thing. And as I said earlier, is it not from these times that all these idioms we just take for granted of the British Stock Exchange, the rising of the Navy, the great conflicts throughout the world, the whole concept of empire, the rising of the great universities, the rising of the merchant class? Who are the merchants named after Mercury? We have some questions here. The very things that we take for granted. The very idea that individuals on the street level say, oh, we can't imagine any secret society just coming in and taking over. Well, that's right. You needn't imagine that because it didn't happen. Secret societies obviously couldn't just come in to the wide diversity of our modern age and just take over. But they didn't do that. These oligarchs formed our cities. They formed the political systems that we have. No more than a few hundred years ago, it was crown or it was gown. It was cross or it was crown. It was monarch on one side to mind control you and brainwash you and throw you in a dungeon, or it was the popes and the potentates. Two forms of control. Nobody just came in and took over. These individuals have created our cities, created our industries. They were there from day one. They were billionaires from the 1st century AD. And they're dancing on their desks to find out how easy it is to manipulate the herd, of the population of the world. But they didn't just suddenly come in and take over like some normal mafioso group. These individuals created the entire structure of our life. Our forefathers, not so long ago, never even ventured more than 5-10 miles from their feudal villages. In fact, it was even a crime to even do so. So nothing could have been easier. You have military, monarchy, and you have the religious, the theocracy. Two forms that attain world domination more simply than we can ever even imagine. David Icke, in his book The Biggest Secret, says, William of Orange, that's William III, died in 1702. He and his wife Mary left no heirs, and so Mary's sister Anne became queen. Anne was the last of the Stuart monarchs. In 1714, the scene was set for the takeover of the British crown by the German black nobility family, the Hanovers. They were closely connected with the House of Hesse, which would become the launch pad for the House of Rothschild. The first Hanoverian king was George I. Queen Victoria, always famous for wearing black jewelry and wearing black clothes, was the Empress of India, the Empress of the world, the top of the Guelph dynasty, the family of Guelph, who was one of the major black nobility families. Today's modern Windsor family directly go back to the Guelph dynasty of the ancient world. The Guelph, Tsarion, Battenberg, Mountbatten, whatever you want to call it. These are all Hanoverian, Habsburgian families, all connected, all linked by blood. The British royal family, the Windsors, was a name adopted in the 1800s, and the reason was to give them an anglicized front, because in fact George I could hardly speak a word of English, and here they are declaring war on his brother the Kaiser in the First World War, and the so-called British royal family could hardly speak the English language. So in order to anglicize them and make them look more English, they adopted the name Windsor. But their original ancestral names is Saxe-Coburg-Battenberg, which they changed again to Mountbatten, Burslyon, which is the name of the Queen Mother, and Guelph. The word Guelph is the key word there because that's the Venetian connection, the Black Guelphs. Open any encyclopedia and start reading up on the black nobility and the Guelphs, and a fascinating story will unfold. Valdemar Valerian refers to them as the Serpentine world order, understanding that these people are from the Serpent dynasties. All subsequent coups d'etats and revolutions and wars of the 19th and 20th centuries are centered in the battle of the Guelphs to hold and enhance their power, now the New World Order. In Atlantis, Alien Visitation and Genetic Manipulation, my book, I point out the fact that, look at the grammar, look at the statement. If you have a new world order, does not that imply in a way that we have an old world disorder? Well, as I've pointed out in this program, there certainly was more than enough disorder in the old world. And for those who think that the American politicians and leaders are in fact Republican and American and disconnected from royal ties, we find from David Icke that the Queen of England made Bush's military chiefs, Colin Powell and Norman Schwarzkopf, honorary knights of the British Empire. Honorary knights of the British Empire. This is not just some minor award you just happen to get of a weekend. These pats on the back show you who these individuals are actually working for. The British system controls the American system and always has. This is a republic on paper. That's it. The Constitution has long been null and void. The country's been bankrupt and in debt for goodness knows how long. And every leader, including Roosevelt, all the way back to the Founding Fathers, has been an agent of the Black Venetians, of the Knights Templar, the Knights of Columbus, the Freemasonic organizations, the Illuminati, and the British system that controls them. Professor Anthony Sutton, who wrote this fine book on the subject, American professor, was actually approached by the Skull and Bones as they attempted to recruit him. And not knowing who on earth this group was, he researched it, he opened their packages, he looked into the whole question, and in horror of who these people were, after years of research, he wrote many books on the subject, including this, America's Secret Establishment, Introduction to the Order of the Skull and Bones. And Sutton has grasped the essence of what we're saying here. He says in his book, their interests are global, and much as they may protest, we see no difference between trilateral globalism and, for example, British and French imperialism of the 19th century, or the Holy Roman Empire, for that matter. How right he is. Webster Tarpley, in the book The Venetian Takeover of England, writes, the oligarchical system of Great Britain is not autochthonous, product of English or British history. It represents rather the tradition, which has been transplanted into the British Isles through a series of upheavals into England and Scotland from the Venetian oligarchy, along with its philosophy, political forms, family fortunes, and imperial geopolitics. Jeffrey Steinberg, in The Last Empire in the History of the World, writes, "These families constitute a financier oligarchy. They are the power behind the Windsor throne. They view themselves as the heirs to the Venetian oligarchy, which infiltrated and subverted England from the period of 1509 to 1715, and established a new, more virulent Anglo-Dutch-Swiss strain of the oligarchical system of Imperial Babylon, Persia, Rome, and Byzantine." So there you have it. There is a direct paragraph that shows you the connection. Incidentally, Switzerland, as we mentioned earlier, is where the headquarters of World Freemasonry is. And over the door in Zurich, Switzerland, you can go there yourself. And that's where the courts are. That's where the so-called charities of the world, like the Red Cross, are located, and many others. It's also where the world banks are kept. Those secretive world banks. Well, of course they're secretive. The oligarchs don't want you tracking the checks, following the money. But you also have the headquarters of World Freemasonry. And over the door, plain as day for everyone to see, it says in Latin, Ordo ab chaos, order out of chaos. Implemented by the likes of Albert Pike and many of the politicians of the world. You create wall-to-wall evil, wall-to-wall debauchery, wall-to-wall license, and wall-to-wall chaos. You fund the gangs, you fund the terrorists of the world. You create so much upheaval that the masses, who are your real enemy, your real rivals, just come to you in a big line saying, help us, what can we do? Let's strengthen the powers of government. If it worked for Adolf Hitler and Genghis Khan, it works for anybody. The statesman and leading economist, Lyndon LaRouche, who himself has spent time in the federal stockade, has this to say: the Venetian method is the method of not taking sides, but playing sides against one another to one's advantage. You go into a country, you go among a people, you go to an individual person and you corrupt them by knowing the principle of corruption, which is embedded in every person. That principle of corruption is the person's self-ego as an autonomous ego, as a microcosm in counterposition, in struggle against the macrocosm. What LaRouche is pointing out here is more metaphysical. He's saying that the individual falls under hypnosis, he falls under control because he himself is divided. This is a more sinister, the more subtle, the more pernicious form of control. It's not just political, it's not just social, it's not just domestic. There's a psychological component to this. And I'll go into this in other programs in the series. But this idea of being in conflict within is the perfect bedrock, the perfect state of affairs that needs to exist before you accept or you become blinded to the conflict around you. You're more susceptible to that kind of control if your body politic, your own republic, is in complete chaos. James Morris, in his book Pax Britannica, says, before she set out on her Diamond Jubilee procession, on the morning of 22nd of June 1897, Queen Victoria of England went to the telegraph room at Buckingham Palace. It was a few minutes after 11 o'clock. She pressed an electric button. An impulse was transmitted to the Central Telegraph Office in St. Martin-le-Grand. In a matter of seconds, her Jubilee message was on its way to every corner of her empire. It was the largest empire in the history of the world, comprising nearly a quarter of the land mass of the earth and a quarter of its population. Victoria herself was Queen Empress of such aged majesty that some of her simpler subjects considered her divine and slaughtered propitiatory goats before her image. So what Morris is bringing out here is the size and magnitude of this empire. And of course, we might ask a very simple question: what do you need empire for? Why would such a small, minuscule, insignificant country like England, of all places, granted with its Venetian Dutch oligarchy in control, why would it suddenly rise to send its tentacles out to the world? What is the reason? That reason has never been really handed to us. It's always put down to power and money, and that just covers it. But now we know of the old Atlantean tie, the old John Dee pact, and the idea that all peoples, all nations, all tribes had to be subjugated. The diamond mines, the ores that were needed to artificially move technology forward, move mankind forward to the point where the technology of the Nephilim could be rebuilt. We still live in those times. It's happening right before our eyes. Now, you have to take what popes say with a pinch of salt, but what Pope Pius VI said in his book, Memoirs of a Renaissance Pope, bears reading about the Venetians. He makes an interesting comment. He says, "But what do fish care about law? As among brute beasts, aquatic creatures have the least intelligence. So, among human beings, the Venetians are the least just and least capable of humanity. And naturally, for they live on sea and pass their lives in the water. They use ships instead of horses. They are not so much companions of men as of fish and comrades of marine monsters. They wish to appear Christians before the world, but in reality they never think of God, and except for the state, which they do regard as a deity, they hold nothing sacred." Jeffrey Steinberg also says, "Among their own ranks, these financier oligarchs refer to themselves as the Club of the Isles, after the original Prince of the Isles, Edward Albert, that's King Edward VII, the son of Queen Victoria, who orchestrated the Crimean War, the Opium Wars, the Russo-Japanese War, and World War I, to consolidate Britain as the primus inter pares, that's the first among equals, of the European monarchs and feudal families. The Club of the Isles, under the direction of the British monarchy, draws its resources and personalities from the Netherlands, Switzerland, France, Germany, and Italy, and orchestrates the actions of the caste of terminally Anglophilic Americans, typified by Henry Kissinger and former President George Bush." Now, in conclusion, in the last chapter of my book, Atlantis, I talk about the fact that here we are at a state where the Nephilim agenda, the Atlantean agenda of getting the technology back and also trying to solve this problem of the Stargate are coming into their latter days. The solution, the final solution, is at hand. And in the book I mentioned that there are 4 possible outcomes, 4 possible conclusion scenarios. You know, there's a reason why the oligarchs love pyramids. And if you stand in front of a pyramid, you'll notice that it's a triangle in front of you. But of course, a pyramid is made of 4 phases, 4 triangles. The swastika is a 4-fold device. The Knights of Malta cross, which is nothing but a pyramid seen from above, by the way. But the Knights of Malta cross is also 4-fold. There seems to be a penchant in secret societies for 4-fold symbolism, and perhaps there's a reason. So taking that motif, taking that paradigm, I thought that there were 4 outcome scenarios that might be played out in the next generation, or even less, next decade or so. Briefly speaking, I call these 4 outcomes: number 1, the burn and rise no more outcome. Number 2 is the bridges to Babylon outcome. Number 3 in the book, it says start the fuse, Tector. And number 4 is the Empire Strikes Back scenario. More specifically, outcome 1, the progeny of Atlantis succeed in regaining all their technological hardware, especially that for breaking through the Stargate, and prepare for departure. In so doing, they come out into the open more than ever, startling the human race, who cannot comprehend what is happening. When they are out of range, they destroy our planet and all that lives on it. Does that seem far-fetched? Well, let's think. Does any criminal like to leave footprints and fingerprints behind? The individuals who came here and got interned on our planet have absolutely no love for us. And even though we're talking about the descendants of the Atlanteans, they have enough alien blood as their treatment of the planet, their treatment of womankind, their treatment of children, their treatment of animals should show you exactly who these people are and what they believe. So criminals do not like to leave traces behind if they can prevent it. So let's just bear that in mind. Outcome 2, the bridges to Babylon. The masters realize that no matter what they do, they cannot vacate the earth, and that they are forever chained to the pit. In this case, they rule the world with unmitigated tyranny, relentlessly and openly. The human race loses whatever privileges, quote unquote, it enjoyed while its utility was beneficial. Now it is deprived and slaughtered. Debauchery is everywhere, and people even turn upon themselves, sinking into chaos of unimaginable proportions, with all the dark, repressed content of consciousness in full view, without the restraint of inner or outer authority. We see many movies, from Judge Dredd to Blade Runner, to all sorts of movies showing the debauchery, the coming chaos in the streets, from They Live to Life Force. Lots of movies contemplating this particular type of scenario where law and order goes out the door and all that is repressed within us, all the years of frustration and hatred, that's encoded in us, the human race just goes crazy with cudgels in the street type of scenario. Number 3, the good, quote unquote, under the weight of the yoke, finally rise against their oppressors, actively preventing them from ever leaving and taking their evil elsewhere. However, to do this, we destroy, that is, sacrifice ourselves, taking them with us. And I'm thinking of Start the Fuse Detector from the Sam Peckinpah movie, The Wild Bunch. I mean, this is kind of heroics that probably would very much impress Sam Peckinpah. Naturally, it's something we would not normally want to choose because it would mean that the earth would just become a revolving headstone. You solve your problem, though. But it's not the best option. However, this kind of scenario almost has taken place several times in history before. In Celtic mythology, if you read in detail the stories of the Taffety Danann and how they had to combat these forces with sword in hand, by the way. They weren't doing it today with microphones, cameras, placards and speeches and books. They actually did it on the field of battle right in front of these individuals. The movie Highlander comes to mind, which in a fictional way shows this particular kind of conflict taking place between the giants and the heroes. Now the fourth outcome, or scenario, which I entitled The Empire Strikes Back, we find that mankind finally discovers the correct means to the end and vanquishes its enemy with no excessive loss of life or homeworld. We eradicate the enemy and finally resolve the problem of evil. The beasts are slain, the damsels rescued, and the ending happy. Now, up until now, even with the vast majority of their sophisticated technical hardware again in their possession, the progeny of the Atlanteans are not able to break out of their quarantine, out of their internment on the silent planet. In the book Against Civilization, we read, the combined military expenditures of all the world's governments in 1987 were so large that all of the social programs of the United Nations could be financed for 300 years. This one caption, this one statement, basically tells us the whole gig. In 1 year, just 1987, we have this vast expenditure on what? Technology and military. But yet every program of the United Nations, they're all screaming for money and let's heal the world, but we can't get round to it. We just don't know how we can crack it. I don't know how backward you have to be to not see what the problem is, what the agenda is. $900+ billion is spent on military budgets a year worldwide, with 50% of that spent by the US. The Pentagon spent $9,000 per second before the 9/11 attack. The percentage of US military spending that would ensure the essentials of life to everyone in the world, according to the United Nations, is a mere 10% of that. That's about $40 billion, which was in fact the amount of funding initially requested to fund our retaliatory attack on Afghanistan. Now, coming to the whole question, the ongoing pursuit of getting out of here, you may build your technology back to the place where you had it 50,000 years ago when you crossed space. You may have those UFOs, and those UFOs are being sighted from Mexico, all over the world, from Australia. Individuals in our modern world are seeing constant evidence. There's plenty of traffic in the sky to prove that there's UFO activity, even though we're being duped into thinking it's true extraterrestrials visiting our planet. We're not aware yet, as I advocate, that these are Earth ships. These are the product not only of Hermann Oberth and Werner von Braun from Germany, but from the Renaissance, from the time of Leonardo da Vinci. And before, we have crafts, I believe, that were able to be rebuilt and flew up into the heavens, discovered the existence of the Stargate. So here we have this problem. Now, in the book, what we talk about is how you would go about then breaking through this. Dee and his macrobes have offered up the world in a ritual. Two of the basic tenets that were handed down was, look, you have to learn how to release energy from matter. But we're going to have to show you that in 2 stages because you're too dumb to get it. They told us to D. They said, you humans are not going to get this. So we'll have hundreds of years just to show you the first, how you release energy from matter, which was, in history, the releasing of the atomic bomb. Then they pat themselves on the back saying, we've got that far. So from that age, from the time of the atom bomb's explosion, the next phase of the macrobes takes place. How now to show how to create matter from energy. This is the high technology that's needed to deal with the Stargate. So SRI, MIT, many of the think tanks and technical agencies that are out there, all the experimentation and research into nanotechnology and virtual reality and all the other expenditures while people are starving in the world. There's an agenda, an occult agenda. And the occult agenda is seen on the logos of half of these corporations. They're not even trying to hide it from us. But they know, as Edgar Allan Poe said, you want to hide something, you put it in plain sight. But there's been other attempts to break through the Stargate. And there have actually been explosions, detonations, huge nuclear and atomic explosions let off in our ionosphere by the governments of the world. Residents in Faulkner and Garland counties believe they saw meteors soaring through the atmosphere just after 10 o'clock on Tuesday night. Experts of the Arkansas Sky Observatory explain it's the end of a major meteor shower related to Halley's Comet. Conway resident Tammy Earnhardt knows is that the sonic boom was enough to rattle her entire house. It just shook all of the doors and everything. It was just a loud boom that shook everything. It sounded like a train was coming through our house. It was that loud. And Joshua Meeks says he saw a big ball of fire like a big flash. I mean, it was almost as big as the moon. Many in Conway and Hot Springs saw those flashes, but it's unclear where or if anything made it to the ground. If it was, in fact, a meteor, they're a rare find in Arkansas. So these explosions, these detonations are going there in an attempt to break through. There's been many different kinds of attempts to help try to break through the Stargate by force, through the new atomic and nuclear technologies that exist. Now, there are 2 natural radiation belts around the Earth, discovered in 1958 by James Van Allen. The natural belts are 64,000 miles deep. The astronauts would have to traverse them for 4 hours. The crafts were extremely thin and not at all protected from radiation of any kind, nor were there linen suits. The radiation in these belts increases when there's solar activity, such as the 11-year solar flare activity. Now, this activity was especially prominent during the Apollo 11 flights in 1967 to 69. Its strongest ever recorded activity was 1972, when the Apollo 13 was launched. So here we have not only it known by scientists that there's tremendous radiation up there. We have these belts that are thousands, literally thousands of miles deep, which would take days to traverse. And then we have to factor in the fact that the hull of the spacecraft, the Apollo, is far too thin to keep out that radiation, as are the spacesuits. And we even then find that the radiation was at its strongest when the Apollo 11 mission was meant to have taken place. The U.S. project A119 in the 1950s was a project to nuke the moon. As we said, the moon is the keystone, the lodestone that in some way is the active principle in the generation of the Stargate. The moon has some important relevance here as a kind of a lodestone in the Stargate. Well, the Rand Corporation and Kellogg wanted to nuke the moon in 1956. NASA in 57 had Project Red Sox, which was dedicated to the research of how to do that. Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, was very eager to have the moon nuked, to put nuclear explosions on the moon. And the Soviets in 1950 had Project E4. In 1962, another radiation belt was artificially created by the US military when they detonated a megaton nuclear bomb 248 miles above the Earth in order to create a corridor through the natural belts. The radiation from this detonation created a third belt with 100 times the radiation of the other belts. Sir Bernard Lovell said that the detonation was cataclysmic. So these villagers in Arkansas are seeing flashes in the sky. Flashes in the sky, we've got nuclear explosions in the megatons going off up there, destroying our ionosphere. This desperate attempt We might even question, why would you want to create a passageway through the ionosphere in this particular kind of means, unless there was another agenda that we're not being told? Believe it or not, there was even an attempt, even there's a technology research to find a way to move the planet Earth to a new location of our solar system. They claim they need to do this to offset the worst effects of global warming. Yeah, right. Now, I want to be specific here. This was an idea to literally move the planet Earth from its original orbit, which I believe is tied into the idea that they're thinking that if you can do that, that might also break the chain, break the Stargate, to literally move the planet Earth itself. One of the most important methodologies, and possibly one that might in the future be even successful, is microwave technology, such as HAARP, which was originally created or researched in Alaska, which is powerful microwave technology. In my book, I actually go into the fact that it is the superheating of the atmosphere, the superheating of the ionosphere, and it is these nuclear detonations that is responsible for the ozone hole. And it's not CFCs and the McDonald's cartons. CFCs are a contributing factor to problems in the ozone, but CFC molecule is 3 times heavier than air. It doesn't rise, it sinks. So if CFCs got up there, it's because of nuclear detonations on the Earth. It's to do with the upswing from rockets when they're taking off and going up there. They drag the dust up there and take the CFCs there. And CFCs have been an agricultural problem for many years. But the real contributing factor to the hole in the ozone layer, now nicely covered up, is in fact the superheating of the ionosphere by microwave technology and detonations up there. Now HAARP is very important in this scenario because it has been specifically designed to try and break through the Stargate. It's pretty much an analogy can be used of a burglar. Any type of burglar who's trying to penetrate through a security fence, the idea is to put a dummy wire situation. You connect a dummy wire here and a dummy wire here to break the circuit, and then you can cut the main fence and leave yourself a portal to go through. Now, of course, you don't go up to the ionosphere with a pair of pliers or a hacksaw, but what you can do is try to break the Stargate and open a portal by way of lasers and microwave technology. Microwave technology is created in Alaska, it's all tested, then they mount it onto satellites, which help to create a beam either on the moon or out into outer space. And by beaming these high-frequency microwave beams onto the Stargate, they're hoping to break through. And as yet, they have not been successful. Now, all its combined transmitters send 3.6 million watts of radio frequency output. Jerry Smith, in his book HAARP, The Ultimate Weapon of the Conspiracy, writes, HAARP has a unique feature, a patented ability to focus these transmissions into a single point high in the sky. This magnifies an output of 1,000 times, giving HAARP an effective radiated power in excess of 3.6 billion watts. So HAARP is normally, when it's on Earth, about 3.6 million watts, which is, by the way, almost 1 million times more powerful than the documents at its inception say it needed to be. So it's millions of times. Nick Bajik will admit this, the man who uncovered the HAARP agenda in his book, Angels Don't Play This HAARP, and so on. He also is confounded by this, because not knowing what the real use of HAARP is and thinking it's just a military device, cannot explain how it is 1 million times more powerful than it ever could possibly need to be for military purposes. Well, it's very easy to explain. There's no mystery once you understand what the agenda is, the real agenda. But as Smith is saying here, HAARP can be focused so that it even has so much more power than that. 3.6 billion watts is actually its full potential. He says, the signal will be sent to the top of our atmosphere where it is intended to heat a portion of the sky. This type of transmitter is called an ionospheric heater. There are several ionospheric heaters in use around the world today. HAARP, however, will be many times more powerful than all of them combined. Now, Richard Allen Miller and Iona Miller, in the Nexus magazine, volume 10, in their interview say, Researcher Guy Kramer has suggested that HARP array may be used to bounce deadly signals off the ionosphere and moon to target sites on Earth and with major explosions, virtually eliminating the need for tactical nuclear weapons. And there's no denying that, yes, the lower level people involved in this, the lower level military people who are not privy to the main agenda, that's what the beauty of a pyramid is, are working on it happily because they think, yes, this is a perfect weapon, and oh, we won't need SDI, and we won't need all of these other clunking military apparatus. Let's just have HARP, and we can incinerate people all over the planet. It's the super weapon. How wonderful. It'll be just like a video game. Right, they think that. But what's the real agenda, the real power? The 3 billion watt signal originating in Alaska can be caroomed off the moon to reach virtually everywhere on the planet, on the surface or underground with heat radiation. Since it does not leave contamination, it can even terminate targets covertly. But guess what? HARP is funded by Arco Corporation, which is owned by, oh, guess who? The British Queen Elizabeth. Arco connotes the word archon, which means fallen angel. That's right. We have to look at the subliminal way that we're being told things. It's very important to open your symbolic literacy. So Atlantic Richfield Corporation, Company, etc., that's its official meaning, but there's another meaning beside that. Anyone who's done their homework, who knows the ancient magical languages of the ancient world, knows and recognizes the word arco. It comes from the word archon, which means the fallen angels, or the intelligence of the fallen angels. Just like we looked at earlier, the cosmocrates, those who are the angelic beings who overlook the cities and the rituals of the world. HARP is also used for several other reasons. One of the most important is to trap incoming UFOs. It's very important to note this, that many of the UFOs that visit our planet, you can come through the semi-permeable membrane of the Stargate. So the elites on this planet realize, listen, we're having problems for hundreds and hundreds of years trying to vacate the planet. What would happen if we could create a web-like frequency, microwave frequency, that could in fact trap and down other UFOs incoming? Then, if we were able to down them successfully, we'd be able to loot those ships and find out how they work, and perhaps even use those very ships, once we know how they work, to get out of here. That's another scenario. If I was them, I'd probably be thinking that as well. And that's what Roswell and a lot of the other crashes are all about, because it's a little bit too much of a stretch of the imagination, is it not? To think that spaceships that can cross hyperspace, cross the event horizons of suns, fly throughout the universe, then just happen to suddenly career and caroom out of control as soon as they enter into our atmosphere. And Richard Hoagland and others have even got footage showing that there are Earth agencies shooting some set of rays to incoming craft. This has actually been videotaped by NASA. The idea is to trap one of these like a fly in the middle of the air and try to bring it down. And in most cases it doesn't work. But there has been cases in which it has worked. And these ships have been downed. Military have been on the spot in a few minutes. And these entities and beings that are in these ships have been taken away to Area 51 and to other locations to be debriefed. And the ships, of course, their technology will be studied thoroughly in order to assist humans to vacate the planet. But one of the other most important aspects of HARP was to create the possibility for mass mind control. With HARP and these radio frequencies and radiotronic weaponry mounted on the satellites, mind control on a mass scale becomes much more easy. And the term that is technically used for that type of behavior control or mind control is entrainment. And in Jerry Smith's book, which is an excellent book, you can read about the actual power of HARP in that matter. And Jerry Smith is getting his information from one of the leading lights in this kind of study, Jim Keith. He was, of course, assassinated. The great scholar Jim Keith, in his book Mass Control, is one of the leading researchers on the subject of mind control. Goes into the history of Dr. Jose Delgado that we mentioned earlier, a fine scholar in this particular field. And he talks about entrainment. Now, fitting into our 4 scenarios, of course, if scenario 2 was to take place, which means that the Nephilim, the progeny, realize they're not going anywhere. They cannot leave here. So they're stuck with it. They've got all the technology, but they ain't going anywhere. Then they start to rule and reign openly. There's no more covert action. There's no more secret societies, no more hidden government. They come out into the open, and they need to make, because their numbers are few, they need to make use of this kind of technology to control everyone. In Northern Ireland, it's a simple gun to the head situation, which is the most primitive way you can do it, to control the whole of the population there. But there's different kinds of weaponry for a country of this size or for the world in general. Now, Richard Allen Miller and Iona Miller in their Nexus magazine interview say, for epochs, Schumann resonances have provided the orchestrating pulse for life on this planet, our planetary heartbeat, which sets the tempo for health and well-being. But now the very heart of the planet is in jeopardy, according to Framework Convention on Climate Change. ELF, that's extra low frequencies, from Schumann resonance are intimately linked with those of brain waves. Natural or artificially induced changes in the Schumann resonance could affect the subtle and perhaps gross brain wave generation. Liquid crystals, which are DNA, brain ventricles, and cellular structures, in the human body may operate as antenna for detecting and decoding such global and local ELF signals. So let's be in no doubt from what these researchers are saying, our body is an electromagnetic antenna. Should there be any fluctuation not only in the normal Earth energies, but should those be influenced or precipitated by external interference, the human body will respond dramatically and almost instantly. There is an harmonic relationship between the Earth and our mind-body. Earth's low-frequency isoelectric field, the magnetic field of the Earth, and the electrostatic field that emerges from our bodies are closely interwoven. Our internal rhythms interact with external rhythms, affecting our balance, our REM patterns, and mental focus. Schumann resonance waves probably help regulate our body's internal clock, affecting sleep and dream patterns, arousal patterns, and hormonal secretion. Environmental rhythm, the fundamental driving system for all life on our small blue planet, is jeopardized by human manipulation of the ionosphere, such as HAARP. 90 Russian deputies signed an appeal against the HAARP program, charging that the experiments would create weapons capable of breaking radio communication lines and equipment installed on spaceships and rockets, could provoke serious accidents in electricity networks and in oil and gas pipelines, and have a negative impact on the mental health of people populating entire regions. Some researchers are speculating that the entrainment process has already happened or is being dabbled in, and that's why there's a rising levels of depression and delinquency in our world that cannot be normally explained in any other way. Jim Keith was certainly a big believer that this entrainment process has already begun in certain regions of the world. Now, in the book of Enoch, we read, "And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones." And this whole campaign against nature is central stage in this whole scenario. From the earliest times, certainly from the post-Diluvian epochs that we were looking at, right down to the present day. The whole extent of this crime against the planet, we can read here. Ecologists fear that we are losing between 50 and 150 species each day, a rate thousands of times higher than the evolutionary background extinction rate of about one species a year. Some estimate that we have lost perhaps 600,000 species since the biotic holocaust began around 1950. If present trends continue, half of all the species on Earth would be extinct in the next 50 years. Overhunting, pollution, and climate change are factors in this sixth mass extinction event. But by far the greatest cause is habitat loss. The lost ecological services would be devastating. It may take 5 million to 10 million years for biological diversity to recover. Half of the Earth's original forest cover is gone, and an additional 30% is degraded and fragmented. Only 20% of the original forest on Earth remains today as large, relatively undisturbed frontier forests. And half of this frontier forest is threatened by human activity, mostly by logging. Another 100,000 square miles of forest is lost each year, mostly in the tropics, and only a very small amount of this forest loss is offset by regrowth. Since 1960, about 30% of the Earth's tropical forests have disappeared, and with them, thousands of species. Between 50% and 90% of the terrestrial species inhabit and depend upon the forests, and more than half of the threatened vertebrate species on Earth are forest animals. Now, the United Nations says that $40 billion a year, about what consumers spend on cosmetics, would provide everyone on Earth with clean water, sanitation, health care, adequate nutrition, and education. The Secretary General of the 1992 Earth Summit cautioned, "No place on the planet can remain an island of affluence in a sea of misery. We're either going to save the world, the whole world, or no one will be saved." But it's an old story, and it's been foreseen by the prophets of old, perhaps some of the Lemurian bloodline, who are the bringers of culture, the sensitive ones, the ones with the human DNA, who have sensed these travesties even before they've begun. From Pastor Bartholomeus, in 1638, we read a prophecy. He says, "A great change will come to pass, such as no mortal man will have expected. Heaven and hell will confront each other in this struggle. Old states will perish, and light and darkness will be pitted against each other with swords. But it will be swords of a different fashion. With these swords, it will be possible to cut up the skies and to split the earth. A great lament will come over all mankind, and only a small batch will survive the tempest, the pestilence, and the horror." In Isaiah 24, "Broken down is the city of chaos. Every home is shut up, so that none can enter. In the streets there is an outcry. All joy has reached its eventide. The mirth of the world is gone. Desolation is left to the city, and its gates are battered to ruins." Was Isaiah talking about his own times or something to come? It would be a good idea to understand why it is that the space shuttle, not only the space shuttle, but many other programs have the names that they do. The space shuttle Atlantis, on its way out into the nether. All the funding and research that goes into this type of technology. It has a purpose. Ronald Reagan himself said, "If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species or from some other planet, we'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our two countries, and we would find out once and for all that we really are all human beings on this earth." This was Ronald Reagan's speech in a full session of the United Nations on September 21st, 1987. He's literally telling us there are only a handful of people who know the truth about this, that an alien force is already present and has been present on the earth. And we are being told, we have been warned. Many movies, many books, many researchers, so we have warnings not only from the traditional non-fiction, from hardcore scientists, specialists, and researchers, but we have it in fiction, reaching the masses, reaching the mass populace of the world. They're seeing it in visual images before their eyes. Here from the show and the film Stargate, the concept is a traveler from distant stars escaped from a dying world looking for a way to extend his own life. His body, decaying and weak, he could not prevent his own demise. Apparently, his whole species was becoming extinct. So he traveled, searched the galaxies looking for a way to cheat death. He came to a world rich with life, where he encountered a primitive race, humans, a species which, with all his powers and knowledge, he could maintain indefinitely. He realized within a human body he had the chance for a new life. He found a young boy. So Ra took him and possessed his body like some kind of a parasite looking for a host. And, inhabiting this human form, he appointed himself ruler. There was a rebellion on earth. Fearful, Ra outlawed reading and writing. He did not want people to remember the truth. And what are we being told in movies like this? In Highlander, we read this remarkable statement. We hear the voice of Sean Connery narrate the following at the very inception of the film. "From the dawn of time we came, moving silently down through the centuries, living many secret lives. No one has ever known we were among you until now." Evil can be defined as any kind of behavior which allows one person to progress at the cost of another's overall material, emotional, or spiritual welfare. It is a fine line, since almost all human interaction is based on some form of manipulation, either soft manipulation or hard. However, the hard form of manipulation that seeks to progress at the loss of others can and should be defined as evil. We have learned to excuse those who perpetrate evil, to suspend justice, turn the other cheek, and blind ourselves to the manipulation which is perpetrated daily upon us and upon others in the world. Many even associate such manipulation with strength, and those who exercise this kind of manipulation actually gain great pleasure from seeing others suffer and fall. When we realize the extent of their mental corruption, we can begin to take appropriate measures to defend ourselves and even go on the attack. We often talk about humanity and our service to humanity, but the word humanity contains the word human. If we don't first know what it is that makes us truly human, there is not much credence in talking about humanity. Humanity must be made up of human beings, aware of what it means to be truly human. Most of what we call human is, as I have demonstrated, alien in nature. So truly serving humanity is to be serving the human in us. But we can serve that best when we expose what is anti-human in us and exercise from our own natures the traits and drives which force us to believe in and act upon all that is totally foreign to us, that which poisons our minds, emotions, and our planet. While we inhabit this planet, we each have one sovereign purpose, which is to leave the planet in a better state than when we found it. To even begin to do so, we have to have our own lives in order and be connected to our own Dharma. That is, we must be living authentically and being passionately and creatively involved in something which is a true extension of our own uniqueness. This is man's true religion. However, no sooner do we try to attend to this than the time comes when we will invariably come up into conflict with those whose motives are diametrically opposite. That is, to leave the planet in a worse condition than when they found it. The serpent masters who visited our planet ages ago arrived and took over without permission. They literally invaded our sovereign planet and interfered with the destiny and evolution of the native inhabitants while possessing no legal status, so to speak. Like many terrestrial illegal immigrants, these aliens had, and their progeny have, no love for the world they occupy. Their treatment of the earth tells us as much. Their plundering of nations, their decimation of indigenous peoples, and their violation of nature should be taken as ample evidence of their origins. The human victims of the earth must therefore remedy the injustices perpetrated against them by assertively taking back their power and exercising their birthrights as earth citizens. Men and women, as their own immigration officers, so to speak, have the right to bring justice and even expunge those who have violated the universal law, human sovereignty, and who have themselves no rights or status or jurisdiction or authority. The so-called controllers or hidden masters, the secret chiefs, those descendants of the original alien visitors whose influence and machinations have wrought untold horrors on the earth, have absolutely no legal right to hold their offices, to pass their laws, to exercise command, or to foment wars, or to slaughter, impoverish, enslave, divide, and mislead mankind. They have no right to interfere in any way with the destiny and evolution of the earth. Since they have appropriated these rights, they must be held totally accountable for every one of their machinations and crimes. As I have shown, the Nephilim have not, as some scholars assert, left this planet in the days of old. Therefore, they are not about to return to save us from ourselves. They have never been away, and it is they who have brought the conditions that plague us. I trust I have explained in the course of this program something of the origin and agenda of these dark and inhuman forces. The work towards their continuing exposure and final elimination continues.